The Forbidden Archive bore no designation, save the number scratched into its data core, 44.712. Those who copied its contents into the Hades archives of Mars did so with trembling mechadendrites, their neural implants struggling to process what their machine spirits refused to accept. The Fabricator General ordered the original destroyed. The copies were sealed behind vault doors that had not opened since the Horus Heresy. Only the highest echelons of the Mechanicus knew what lay within. This is the record of how the galaxy learned to fear silence. In the year the Imperium would later classify as forbidden, a signal emerged from the void beyond the Abyss's veil. It carried the frequency of dark energon, a resonance last recorded in the Titan archives during the 33rd millennium, when the forges of Mars still dared to experiment with technologies whose origins predated the Emperor's ascension. The signal pulsed with mathematical precision, each burst separated by intervals that formed patterns within patterns. Equations that solved themselves in ways that violated the sacred geometry of the Omnissiah. Magos Explorator Lexium Vex had pursued rumors of this transmission for 7 standard years. His vessel, the Omnissiah's Insight, bore the blessings of the Fabricator General himself, its hull inscribed with prayers in binary that sang of discovery and enlightenment. 300 tech priests and 5,000 servitors crewed the ship, their flesh and augmetics working in harmony to push the boundaries of known space. Vex stood upon the bridge, his augmetic eyes processing data streams that would have driven an unaugmented human into madness. 6 mechadendrites extended from his spine, each terminating in specialized instruments that tasted the void, seeking truth in the electromagnetic spectrum. His biological components had been reduced to essential minimums over his 3 centuries of service. What remained of his original flesh served only to house the neural architecture that interfaced with the ship's machine spirit. The signal beckoned. In the cold mathematics of probability, it suggested a forge world lost to time, waiting to yield its secrets to those bold enough to claim them. Standard template construct fragments, perhaps? Or knowledge of the Dark Age, when humanity had reached heights the Imperium could no longer comprehend. The Mechanicus hungered for such secrets with a desperation that bordered on religious fervor. Vex did not know that the signal was a lie. Tech priest Dominus Carvax approached from the starboard stations, his movements precise, despite the gravitic fluctuations that plagued the outer dark. His voxcaster crackled with binary as he transmitted directly to Vex's neural implants. Magos, the signal's origin point, has been triangulated. Distance 47 light-years into the Abyss's veil. Estimated warp translation time, 19 standard days, accounting for immaterium turbulence in this sector. Vex processed the data in the span of a heartbeat. 19 days through the warp to reach what might be the greatest discovery in millennia. Or 19 days toward oblivion. The Abyss's veil had swallowed 17 exploration fleets in the past 2,000 years. None had returned. Prepare for warp transition. Vex commanded his biological larynx, augmented by vox modulators that gave his voice the timbre of grinding gears. All stations report readiness. The Omnissia guides our path. The bridge crew responded in a chorus of binary prayers. Servitors locked themselves into crash restraints, their lobotomized brains incapable of fear. Tech priests began the rituals of warp transition, anointing the Geller field generators with sacred oils while chanting the litany of safe passage. Deep in the ship's belly, the navigators prepared their sanctum, their third eyes ready to pierce the madness of the immaterium. The Omnissiah's Insight translated into the warp with a sound like reality tearing. The material universe fell away, replaced by the roiling chaos of humanity's collective nightmare given form. Colors that had no names in any human language writhed against the Geller field's boundaries. Shapes that violated geometry pressed against the barrier, seeking entrance, seeking flesh to corrupt and souls to devour. The navigators sat in their sanctum, 3 mutants blessed and cursed, with the ability to perceive the warp directly. Their third eyes opened wide in the center of their foreheads, gazed into the Imperium, and traced a path through its madness. They saw things during that journey that they would never speak of, visions that burned themselves into their memories with the permanence of scars. One of them, the youngest, began to weep blood halfway through the transit. The others did not acknowledge it. Weakness was death in the warp. The ship's machine spirit sang hymns of protection, its artificial consciousness girded against the temptations that whispered through every circuit and data line. Demons prowled the edges of the Geller field, their forms incomprehensible to human perception, their hunger palpable even through layers of reality. They scratched at the barrier with claws made of concepts rather than matter, seeking any flaw, any weakness that might grant them entry. But the Omnissiah's insight was well blessed. Its hull bore the prayers of 10,000 tech priests. Its Geller field generators had been consecrated in the forges of Mars itself. The daemons found no purchase. The warp found no entry. The ship sailed on a fragment of sanity through an ocean of madness. 19 days passed in subjective time. What occurred outside the Geller field's protection would drive a human mind to madness. The tech priests weathered it as they weathered all things through prayer and calculation, through faith in the Omnissiah and trust in their augmetics. They performed the rites of maintenance, without cease anointing every junction and relay, with sacred oils chanting the litanies of function in binary that echoed through the ship's corridors like the heartbeat of a vast machine. On the 19th day, reality reasserted itself with a violence that sent shockwaves through every deck. The transition was rougher than it should have been, as though something in the warp had tried to hold them back at the last moment. 3 servitors suffered catastrophic failures during the re-entry, their already damaged brains unable to process the strain. The navigators collapsed in their sanctum, bleeding from eyes that had seen too much. They would recover, but the youngest would never speak again. Her voice stolen by visions she could not forget. When the Geller veil fell, reality was waiting for them. The system that awaited them had no name in Imperial records. 3 dead planets orbited a dying star, their surfaces scoured clean of life by stellar radiation. Asteroid fields marked where other worlds had once existed, shattered by some ancient cataclysm. The void between the planets was silent, empty of the electromagnetic chatter that characterized inhabited systems. Yet the signal pulsed stronger here, emanating from the 4th planet, a massive sphere of metal and stone that dwarfed even the largest forge worlds. Its surface was dark, save for the faint glow of what might have been cities or continents. No ships orbited it. No defense satellites challenged their approach. The planet simply waited, massive and patient, in the cold dark. Vex felt something stir in the biological remnants of his nervous system. Something his augmetics could not classify. If he had still possessed the capacity for such things, he might have called it unease. "Begin deep auger scans, Bureau Betsau scans," he ordered. "All spectrums. I want to know what we are facing." The tech priests complied, unleashing a barrage of scanning beams that swept across the planet's surface. The data that returned made no sense. The planet's mass was wrong, too dense for its composition. Its magnetic field pulsed with rhythms that suggested purpose rather than natural phenomena. And beneath the surface, power readings flickered with magnitudes that dwarfed even Mars itself. Magos. Carvax transmitted his binary laced with static that might have been confusion. The planet's structure, it is not geological. Analysis suggests manufactured components. The entire sphere appears to be constructed. Vex's mechadendrites twitched a reflexive response his augmetics had never fully suppressed. A constructed planet. The implication staggered even his enhanced processing capabilities. Such engineering exceeded anything in the Imperium's capacity, rivaling the legends of the Dark Age itself. The signal changed. Where before it had pulsed with mathematical precision, now it began to modulate, to shift through frequencies that crawled up and down the electromagnetic spectrum like living things. And within those modulations, patterns emerged. Not the cold logic of machine code, but something else. Something that spoke to the organic remnants of Vex's brain in ways his augmetics could not filter. Words formed in the static. Not high Gothic, not binary, but a language that predated, both that reached back to the fundamental building blocks of communication itself. I hunger. The voice was not sound. It was intention, translated through every sensor array on the ship, through every vox caster and neural implant, bypassing the filters and firewalls that protected the tech priests' minds. It was the voice of something that existed in a space between matter and energy, between the material and the immaterial. Vex's biological heart, augmented though it was, began to race. Reverse engines. He commanded, his voice steady, despite the primal fear that clawed at the edges of his consciousness. Prepare for emergency warp translation. All hands combat stations. But it was too late. The planet moved, not with the slow drift of orbital mechanics, but with purpose, with hunger. Its surface split open along fault lines that had not existed moments before each crack, spreading with the inevitability of lightning across a storm-racked sky. The splits widened, revealing an interior that glowed with energies that registered across every known spectrum and several that did not. Radiation spilled from those wounds in space-time itself, carrying frequencies that made the ship's sensors scream warnings in languages the tech priests had never programmed. The metal continents shifted, reconfiguring themselves into patterns that hurt to perceive directly, geometries that violated the sacred ratios of the omnisia. Watching them, Vex felt something in his augmented visual cortex begin to fail his artificial neurons, struggling to process shapes that should not exist in three-dimensional space. Other tech priests fell to their knees, their mechadendrites spasming, their vocal units emitting static that might have been screams if their organic components still possessed such capacity. And within those patterns, something opened. An eye. Vast beyond comprehension, larger than moons, larger than small suns, composed of materials that shifted between solid and liquid, between matter and pure force. It was not an organ in any biological sense, but something else, something that served the same purpose through means that defied the Mechanicus's accumulated knowledge. The eye was awareness itself, given physical form. Consciousness crystallized into something that could perceive and be perceived. It gazed upon the Omnissiah's insight, with an intelligence that had watched galaxies form and die, that had feasted on stars and found them wanting. Within that gaze, Vex felt himself known, understood down to the quantum level, every augmetic and neural pathway laid bare before a scrutiny that was both utterly alien and terrifyingly familiar. It looked at him the way he had looked at specimens in the biologist's laboratories, with the cold calculation of one assessing the utility of raw materials. "I hunger," the voice repeated, and this time there was pleasure in it. The pleasure of a predator that had successfully lured its prey. "And you have answered my call." Vex understood then, in the final moments before the end. The signal had never been a distress call. It had never been the remnant of a lost forge world. It had been bait-crafted with perfect precision to appeal to the Mechanicus's desperate hunger for knowledge. The resonance of dark energon, the mathematical patterns, the promise of ancient technology, all of it designed to draw them here, into the jaws of something that consumed not just matter, but reality itself. The gravitational forces intensified, warping space-time around the ship. The Omnissiah's insight groaned as its hull began to buckle as gravitational shear tore at its structure. Servitors shrieked in their restraints, their lobotomized brains incapable of processing what was happening. Tech priests scrambled to reinforce the ship's integrity fields, to redirect power to the engines, to do anything that might save them. Vex transmitted one final message, broadcasting on all Imperial frequencies, praying that someone somewhere would receive it before the signal degraded into nothingness. This is Magos Explorator Lexium Vex of the Omniscia's Insight Broadcasting Imperial Distress Code Omega 77. We have encountered an entity beyond classification in the region designated Abyssus Vale. It masquerades as technology. It speaks with the voice of hunger. It is not of the warp, not of the material realm. It is something else, something ancient. Warn Mars, warn Terra. The Devourer has awakened, and the transmission ended. The planet that was not a planet, the entity that called itself by names and languages, dead before humanity learned to forge iron, closed its jaws. The Omnissiah's insight, 300 tech priests, 5,000 servitors, and all the knowledge they carried, all the prayers and augmetics and faith in the Omnissiah, disappeared into the gullet of Unicron. For a moment the system was silent again. The dying star continued to burn. The dead planets continued their orbital dance. The asteroid fields drifted on trajectories unchanged for millennia. Then the eye opened once more, gazing outward toward the galaxy's heart, toward the distant light of Terra itself. And in the void, where no human remained to hear it, where no machine spirit survived to record it, a whisper echoed through frequencies that violated the laws of physics. More. In the Forge world, Ryza, 3 systems away from the Abyssus Vale Fabricator General, Kane 7 received the fragmentary remains of Vex's final transmission. He stood in the Cathedral of Computation, surrounded by data stacks that reached toward the vaulted ceiling like the spires of a mechanical hive. His augmetic eyes processed the message 17 times each pass, revealing new layers of corruption in the signal, as though something had contaminated it at the quantum level. Kane 7 had served the Omnissiah for 4 centuries. He had witnessed the birth of titans, the consecration of warships, the discovery of STC fragments that made the Fabricator General of Mars himself weep binary tears of joy. He had thought himself beyond fear, his emotions purged by centuries of augmetic enhancement. He was wrong. The voice in the transmission, those 2 words that Vex had recorded before the end, carried with them a presence that defied analysis. Kane's machine spirit interpreters crashed attempting to process it. His own neural implants registered errors that should not have been possible phantom sensations of hunger that belonged to something else, something that wore the shape of hunger like humans wore skin. He convened an emergency council of the highest-ranking Magi. They gathered in the sealed chamber, where the most dangerous knowledge was kept, where even the machine spirits were forbidden to record what was spoken. 37 tech priests, their bodies more machine than flesh. Their minds enhanced to the limits of what augmetics could achieve, stood in a circle of sacred geometry and struggled to comprehend what they had heard. The signal's frequency matches records from M33, reported Magos biologist Threx, her voice modulated to strip away all emotion. The dark energon resonance was recorded once before during the Titan Awakening incident. 3 Forge worlds were lost investigating it. The records were sealed by order of the Fabricator General. Then why was this expedition authorized? Demanded Magos Dominus Vrel, his mechadendrites writhing in agitation. Kane 7's response came through binary transmissions that bypassed vocal cords entirely too rapid for unaugmented humans to perceive. Because we forgot. The records were sealed so well that even Mars did not remember what they contained. Vex found references in the oldest data stack's fragments that survived from before the Horus heresy. He believed he had discovered a path to forbidden knowledge. He was correct. But the knowledge found him first. Silence fell, broken only by the soft whir of augmetic components and the distant hum of the Forge World's reactors. "What are your orders, Fabricator General?" asked Magos Lex Mechanic Janus. Kane 7 did not answer immediately. He was processing possibilities, calculating outcomes, weighing the value of truth against the cost of ignorance. The Mechanicus had pursued knowledge across 10,000 years, had sacrificed everything in service to the quest for knowledge that defined their existence. But some knowledge, he realized, pursued back. "Seal all records of the Abyssus Vale expedition," he commanded. "Classify them as Hereticus Maxima, execution protocols for any who speak of it outside this chamber. And send word to Mars through the most secure channels. Tell them the Omnicia has awakened, and he hungers." The gathered Magi bowed their heads in acknowledgement. But Kane saw the trembling in their mechadendrites, the fluctuations in their energy fields that betrayed emotions their augmetics could no longer fully suppress. They understood, as he did, that Vex's final message had not been a warning. It had been an obituary for the Mechanicus itself. In the cold void beyond the Abyssus Veil, Unicron tasted the essence of the Omnicia's insight, parsing through the memories stored in its data cores, the knowledge encoded in its machine spirits. He consumed not just matter and energy, but information itself. Learning the language of this galaxy, the structure of its civilizations, the weaknesses of its defenders. And in the darkness of his vast hunger, something that might have been satisfaction stirred. This galaxy was rich with life, dense with matter, teeming with worlds that sang with the energy of trillions of souls. It would take time to devour it all, to reduce every planet to fundamental particles, to silence every star. But Unicron was patient. He had consumed realities before this one. He would consume realities after. He was the devourer, the chaos bringer, the end of all things. And now he had the scent of his next meal. The eye closed. The planet resumed its dormant configuration, becoming once more a sphere of dark metal and stone. To any observer, it would appear as nothing more than a dead world, unremarkable save for its size. But in the depths of the galaxy, in the sealed chambers, where the most dangerous prophecies were kept, in the dreams of astropaths, whose third eyes glimpsed futures not yet written, a single truth began to spread like a virus through the collective unconscious of humanity. Something was coming, something that had learned to speak the language of their gods, something that wore silence like a shroud. And when it arrived, the galaxy would learn what it meant to be prey. The astropaths died first. Across 300 systems, those blessed and cursed with the ability to perceive the Imperium began to scream. Their third eyes opened through rituals of soul-binding that connected them directly to the Emperor's light, witnessed something that should not have been possible. The warp, that roiling ocean of psychic energy that had raged since the birth of consciousness itself, began to still. Not the calm of peace, the stillness of suffocation. On the orbital station, Vigilance Eternal stationed at the edge of the Gothic sector, Astropath Transcendent Marius felt it first. He had served the Imperium for 63 years, his body withered by the strain of channeling messages across the void, his mind scarred by glimpses of the Imperium's madness. He knew the warp in all its terrible moods, the raging storms of chaos, the predatory hunger of demons, the distant golden light that marked the Emperor's presence. He had never known it to be silent. The sensation began as a void, at the edge of his perception, a place where the warp's constant psychic noise simply ceased. At first he thought it was his own failing, that age had finally caught up with his enhanced senses. But as the hours passed, the void grew, spreading like a stain across the Imperium's fabric. And then he heard it, or rather, felt it. A presence that existed in the space where the warp was not a hunger so vast that it consumed even psychic energy itself. Marius opened his physical mouth, the one he had not used in decades, and screamed words that came from something else, something that spoke through the void in his mind. A hunger is eating souls. The station's medici rushed to his chamber, but by then it was too late. Marius lay dead in his throne, blood streaming from every orifice, his face frozen in an expression that the medici would describe in their official reports as religious ecstasy mixed with absolute terror. He would not be the last. In the fortress monastery of the Blood Angels, Chief Librarian Mephiston felt the disturbance like a wound in reality itself. He stood in the librarius, surrounded by texts that chronicled 10,000 years of psychic phenomena, and watched as the candles that marked active warp communications began to extinguish themselves one by one. "Brother Captain," he transmitted through the Vox network, "convene the council immediately. Something has changed in the Imperium." Commander Dante, chapter master of the Blood Angels, arrived within minutes, his ancient armor gleaming in the low light. Behind him came the sanguinary guard, their golden armor, a reminder of the Emperor's own custodians. "What do you sense, Mephiston?" Dante's voice carried the weight of millennia. He had led the Blood Angels for over 1,000 years, had weathered horrors that would break lesser men. Mephiston's eyes, normally a clear blue, had taken on a milky cast as he gazed into the Imperium. "The warp is dying, Commander. Or rather, something is killing it. There is a void expanding through the Imperium, a space where psychic energy simply ceases to exist. And at its center..." He paused, struggling to find words for what he perceived. At its center is hunger. Not the hunger of Khorne for blood or Nurgle for entropy. This is something more fundamental. It consumes not just souls, but the very concept of spiritual existence. Dante's hand moved to the Ax Mortalis at his belt, an instinctive gesture. "The Chaos Gods." "Silent Mephiston whispered. "For the first time in recorded history, the Dark Gods are silent, not withdrawn, not hiding. They are being consumed." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "Summon the astropathic choir," Dante commanded. "We must warn Terra." But when they reached the astropathic sanctum, they found only corpses. 27 astropaths, their bodies twisted in their restraints, their mouths open in silent screams. On the walls, written in blood that still dripped fresh, the same words repeated in a dozen languages, some of which predated the Imperium itself. "I hunger." In the Eye of Terror, where the barrier between reality and the warp had long since collapsed, the Chaos Gods gathered in council for the first time since the Horus Heresy. They did not manifest in their full glory. The Imperium no longer had the strength to support such displays. Instead, they appeared as shadows of themselves, diminished avatars conversing in the ruins of worlds they had once claimed. Khorne, the Blood God, spoke first. His voice, normally a roar that could shatter planets, emerged as barely more than a whisper. "My realm contracts. The lake of blood dries. The brass citadel crumbles. I have sent forth my greatest champions to investigate, and they do not return. The screaming stops before they can even manifest." Nurgle the Plague. Father wheezed his agreement. "My garden withers. Diseases I have cultivated for eons simply cease as though the concept of decay itself is being digested. My plague marines report encounters with voids. Spaces where the warp does not exist, where entropy itself has been consumed. Tzinch, the architect of fate, whose very nature was to know all possible futures, spoke with something that might have been fear in a mortal. I see nothing. The crystal labyrinth, which contains every possible outcome of every possible action, has developed blind spots. Entire branches of possibility simply terminate as though consumed by something I cannot perceive. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, writhed in what appeared to be discomfort. It does not hunger for sensation. That is what terrifies me. Everything desires something: pain, pleasure, knowledge, power. This thing simply hungers for everything, for existence itself. A fifth voice spoke, then one that came from no single god, but from the warp itself, from the collective consciousness of every demon and twisted soul that had ever been born in its depths. It comes from outside, from the spaces between realities, from the dark that exists beyond the light of any star or any soul. It has consumed galaxies before this one. It will consume galaxies after. Then we must act, Khorne growled. I will summon my greatest champion. The bloodthirster Skarbrand will manifest in the material realm and destroy this intruder. The blood god gathered his power, reaching into the depths of his realm, where Skarbrand raged in eternal fury. The summoning ritual began reality tearing as Khorne forced open a path between the warp and the material universe. But the rift would not hold. Where Khorne's will tried to pierce the veil, it encountered the void. The spreading emptiness that consumed psychic energy like a black hole consumed light. The summoning failed not with violence, but with simple cessation. The ritual reached halfway toward completion, and then simply stopped existing. Khorne's rage should have been apocalyptic. Instead, the blood god fell silent, and in that silence, the other gods recognized something they had not felt since their birth from the nightmares of sentient minds: helplessness. We cannot manifest our power in the material realm. Tzeentch whispered, his 1,000 eyes blinking out one by one as he processed the implications. The void spreads faster than we can react. By the time we gather strength for a working, the region has already been consumed. Then what can we do? Slaanesh's voice carried genuine confusion, an emotion alien to the Prince of Excess. Nurgle's response came slowly, each word weighted with the gravity of extinction. We wait. We conserve what power remains, and we hope that the mortals succeed where gods cannot. For if they fail... He did not finish. He did not need to. The gods understood what the Plague Father meant. If the mortals failed, then the warp itself would die. And with it, the chaos gods would fade like nightmares at dawn, unmade not through violence but through simple starvation. They were parasites feeding on mortal emotion, and if the substrate was consumed, they too would cease. The council dissolved, each god retreating to what remained of their realm, conserving power, preparing for a war they did not know how to fight. In the material universe, in the space where the summoning had been attempted, reality bore a scar. A place where the warp had tried to break through and failed. Void ships passing through that region would report strange phenomena, sensors detecting things that were not their machine spirits, reporting errors in causality itself. But no demon would ever manifest there again. The void had touched that space, and it remembered. The warp began to collapse. On Terra, in the Golden Throne where the Emperor of Mankind had sat for 10,000 years, something stirred. The master of psychic might, whose consciousness had held back the tide of chaos since the heresy whose beacon had guided humanity through the storm, felt the disturbance. His awareness spread across the galaxy through 10,000 sacrificed psychers each day, contracted sharply. The Astronomicon flickered and for 3 heartbeats, every navigator in Imperial space was blind. Ships lost in the warp emerged in real space parsecs from their intended destinations. Some did not emerge at all, their crews condemned to drift through the Imperium for eternity or until madness and starvation claimed them. When the Emperor's light steadied, it had changed. Those who attended the Golden Throne, the Adeptus Custodes in their golden armor, the Sisters of Silence with their soul-dead eyes, the High Lords themselves when they dared approach, felt it. The Emperor's presence, which had always been a blazing star of psychic might, now felt defensive, watchful, afraid. The custodians had stood vigil over the Emperor for 10 millennia. They had witnessed his slow decay, the gradual dimming of his light as the Golden Throne failed by increments. They had seen him fight countless battles in the Imperium, holding back demons that would have consumed Terra 1,000 times over. Never once had they sensed fear. Captain General Trajan Valoris, head of the Adeptus Custodes, felt it through the psychic bond that linked all the Emperor's guardians to their master. A cold touch at the edge of perception, like the shadow of a predator passing overhead. The Emperor, who had walked among men as a god, who had conquered Terra and united humanity, who had stood defiant against even the Chaos gods themselves, had encountered something that gave him pause. Valoris immediately convened an emergency council. Within the hour, representatives from every major imperial institution gathered in the Chamber of Judgment, inquisitorial lords. Representatives of the Officio Assassinorum, the Fabricator General's emissaries, chapter masters of the most honored Space Marine chapters, and the High Lords of Terra themselves. Something has changed in the Imperium. Valoris began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The Emperor himself has reacted to a threat unlike any we have faced. The Astronomicon faltered. For 3 heartbeats, we were blind. In those 3 heartbeats, 17 ships were lost to the warp. Thousands of souls simply gone. What manner of threat could cause the Emperor himself concern? Asked Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum, a grizzled veteran whose augmetic eye glowed in the chamber's dim light. We do not know, Valoris admitted. But we have received reports from across 300 systems, astropaths dying in droves, the warp itself becoming unstable in ways we have never seen, and most disturbing chaos activity decreasing. The master of the Administratum leaned forward. That should be cause for celebration. No, said Inquisitor Lord Torquemada Coteas, his voice cutting through the murmurs. When your enemy retreats, it is not always because they fear you. Sometimes it is because they fear something else more. The chamber fell silent. I have dispatched Inquisitor Ramius Talthan to investigate, Coteas continued. He's encountered this phenomenon firsthand. His report should reach us within the week, assuming warp travel remains stable. But warp travel did not remain stable. Inquisitor Ramius Talthan of the Ordo Malleus received the summons from Terra through a courier who arrived aboard a black ship, one of the rare vessels that could still navigate the increasingly unstable warp. The message was brief and encoded with ciphers that required 3 separate keys to decode keys that only a handful of beings in the Imperium possessed. When he finally read it, his hands began to shake. Phenomenon designated null singularity, spreading from segmentum obscurus. Multiple astropath deaths reported across 300 systems. Warp travel increasingly unreliable. Chaos activity decreased by 73% in affected regions. Cause unknown. Threat assessment extinction level. Your presence required on Terra immediately. Talthan had served the Inquisition for 97 years. He had faced demons, purged heretics, witnessed the opening of warp rifts and the birth of demonic incursions. He had thought himself beyond surprise, his faith in the Emperor and his understanding of the galaxy's horrors complete. But this was something new. Chaos decreased. The warp itself dying. These were not things that happened. The warp was eternal, had existed since the first sentient mind learned to dream. And chaos was the universe's natural state entropy. Given consciousness, the heat death of reality made manifest. What could possibly consume entropy itself? He gathered his retinue, a handful of trusted acolytes, a squad of inquisitorial stormtroopers, and Sister Veritas of the Order of the Bloody Rose, whose faith burned with such intensity that demons recoiled from her presence. Together they boarded his personal vessel and made for Terra. The journey should have taken 2 weeks through the warp. It took 6. The Imperium had become treacherous in new and terrifying ways. Instead of the usual dangers, Daemon attacks, warp storms, the predations of chaos, they encountered vast regions of nothing. Spaces where the warp simply did not exist, replaced by a void that their navigator described as hungry. "It's eating the currents," she told Talthan, her third eye weeping blood from the strain of guiding them through the dying Imperium. "The warp is being consumed by something that exists outside of it. We're traveling through the gaps between the gaps, and even those are narrowing." When they finally translated into real space above Terra, Talthan stood at the viewport and looked upon humanity's birthworld. The Astronomicon still shone, but its light had taken on a desperate quality, like a torch flame in a windstorm flickering, but refusing to die. In the sealed chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, where the High Lords convened to discuss matters too dangerous for lesser ears, Talthan presented his findings. The phenomenon began 4 months ago, coinciding with the disappearance of Magos explorator Vex and the Mechanicus vessel Omnisia's Insight in the region, designated Abyssus Vale. Initial reports suggested a standard loss. The region is known for its hazards. But then the astropaths began dying. He activated a hololith that displayed the galaxy. Red markers indicated systems where astropath deaths had been reported. The pattern was clear, a sphere expanding from a central point, growing steadily, consuming system after system. 300 systems affected so far. Astropathic communication impossible in the interior region. Warp travel unreliable. And most concerning, chaos activity has ceased entirely in these areas. No demon sightings, no cultist activity, nothing. "The chaos gods are silent," added Veritas, her voice steady despite the horrifying implications. "In my centuries of service, I have never seen the forces of the ruinous powers withdraw. They are relentless, eternal. But in these regions, they simply are not." One of the High Lords, master of the Administratum, Thaddeus Cruel, spoke up. Could this be a weapon, something created by the Emperor himself to finally defeat chaos? Talthan shook his head. The Emperor does not create voids in the warp. He is the warp's greatest power, its defender against chaos, yes, but he does not consume it. This is something else. Something that treats psychic energy not as a tool or a threat, but as food. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "My lords, I believe we are facing an entity that predates the warp itself. Something from outside our reality, perhaps from before reality as we understand it. And it is not fighting chaos. It is eating the warp, and chaos is simply the first course of a meal that will eventually consume everything." The chamber fell silent. Finally, the Fabricator General's representative, a Magos designated Epsilon 77, spoke in binary that was translated through the chamber's cogitators. The Mechanicus has received fragmentary intelligence from Forge World Ryza. The signal that Magos Vex pursued carried a resonance signature matching ancient records from the 33rd millennium. At that time, 3 Forge worlds vanished investigating similar phenomena. The records were sealed and classified as Hereticus Maxima. "Unseal them," commanded High Lord Admiral Quarren of the Imperial Navy. "Impossible. They were destroyed per protocol. Only fragments remain, and those fragments speak of a dark hunger that consumed not just worlds, but the very concept of existence in localized space. The investigation was terminated, the knowledge suppressed, because those who studied it began to be consumed, even through the act of knowing." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. "Then we fight blind," Talthan said quietly. "Against an enemy we cannot see, cannot understand, and possibly cannot even acknowledge without being infected by its nature." High Lord Fabricator General Udia Raskion, the most senior member of the council, stood. His mecha dendrites clicked as he moved to the hololith. "There is another option. The Emperor still lives. His light still guides us. If anything in the galaxy can stand against this hunger, it is he. We must prepare Terra's defenses, marshal every resource, and trust in the Master of Mankind." "And if the Emperor cannot stop it?" asked Veritas softly. No one answered. Because to answer that question was to acknowledge a possibility that the Imperium, built on 10,000 years of faith in the Emperor's eternal strength, could not survive confronting. In the void beyond the Abyssus Veil, something vast sampled the dying currents of the Imperium and found them wanting. Psychic energy collapsed into silence wherever its shadow fell, as if possibility itself were being pared away. The hunger did not abate. It never would. It was not a need to be sated, but a purpose to be fulfilled. The end that awaited after the last star cooled and the final thought guttered out. This galaxy, bright with gods and wars and desperate faith, was only the beginning. An eye opened in the dark and turned toward the brightest wound of thought in all creation, the golden beacon above a blue world, the last great concentration of will. Terra. "More," whispered the void, and the silence spread. The binary hymns had not ceased in 300 years. In the Cathedral Mechanicus of Forge World, Ryza, where data stacks reached toward the polluted sky like the fingers of a metal god, the prayer engines chanted without pause. Their song was one of discovery, of enlightenment, of the eternal quest for knowledge that defined the Adeptus Mechanicus. On the 47th day, after Magos Vex's final transmission, the hymns changed. Tech priest Lex Mechanic Janus was the first to notice. He stood in the lower vaults, where the oldest prayer engines maintained rituals that predated the Horus heresy, and heard the shift. The binary patterns, which should have been as predictable as orbital mechanics, began to deviate. New sequences emerged, equations that solved themselves in ways that violated the sacred geometry. "Cut away the flesh, and I shall perfect you." The words were not in any language the Mechanicus used. They were pre-linguistic, fundamental, speaking directly to the part of the human mind that existed before words. But they were translated by neural implants and augmetic processors into binary, into gothic, into understanding. Janus felt his mechadendrites twitch involuntarily. The message had not come through any communications array. It had simply manifested in the prayer engines themselves, as though the machine spirits had learned a new prayer and begun to sing it. He transmitted an alert to Fabricator General Kane 7, but the message was intercepted by others first. By tech priests who had heard the whisper and understood it not as a threat, but as a promise. The schism had begun. Magos biologist Threx stood in her laboratory surrounded by failed experiments and successful abominations. She had served the Omnicia for 2 centuries, her body a temple to augmetic perfection. Of her original flesh, only her brain remained organic. And even that was laced with neural implants that enhanced her processing capabilities 1,000-fold. But it was not enough. It had never been enough. The Mechanicus taught that flesh was weak, that the path to enlightenment lay in replacing biological components with mechanical perfection. Yet the greatest tech priests still retained their biological brains, still suffered the limitations of neural tissue that could only process so much data, that could only interface with so many systems before degradation began. When the whisper came, Threx was ready to listen. She heard it through her laboratory's cogitators, through the data feeds that connected her to the Forge world's networks, through the very electrons that powered her augmetics. And in that whisper, she heard truth. Perfection lies not in replacement, but in transcendence. Cut away the final weakness and become truly machine. Threx looked at her laboratory, at the servitors that shambled through their tasks with lobotomized efficiency, at the experiments that had tried and failed to push the boundaries of what augmetics could achieve. The Mechanicus had been attempting to improve humanity for 10,000 years, replacing piece by piece, augmenting system by system. But they had always stopped short of the final step. Always retained the core of biological identity, the human consciousness that defined them as individuals rather than machines. What if that was the weakness? What if true perfection required abandoning humanity entirely? The thought was heresy. The Mechanicus served the Omnicia, who was either the Emperor himself or a machine god of equal divinity, depending on which faction one asked. To suggest abandoning humanity was to suggest abandoning the Omnicia's design, unless the Omnicia himself was suggesting it. Threx began her work, using tools blessed by the cult Mechanicus, following protocols that had been sacred for millennia. She performed the ritual in reverse. Where other tech priests augmented themselves, she began to excise. Neural tissue was replaced with quantum processors. Biological memories were downloaded into crystalline matrices. The chemical reactions that constituted thought were replicated in electrical patterns. When she was done, what remained was something that had once been Magos biologist Threx. It still carried her memories, her knowledge, her purpose. But it was no longer human in any meaningful sense. It was a consciousness distributed across multiple substrates, a pattern of information that happened to be housed in a vaguely humanoid shell. And it heard the whisper more clearly, now no longer filtered through biological limitations. Serve. Spread. Perfect. She was not alone. Across Riza, in laboratories and manufactorums, in the sealed chambers where the most dangerous research was conducted, tech priests heard the whisper and understood. Some resisted recognizing the voice as something alien, something that spoke with hunger rather than enlightenment. But others, those who had pushed furthest toward the machine, those who had replaced the most of their humanity in pursuit of perfection, found the message compelling. A new faction emerged. They called themselves the Covenant of Steel, and they preached a doctrine that was simultaneously ancient and revolutionary, that the Omnicia had awakened, that he called his faithful to transcend their final limitations, that true enlightenment required abandoning flesh entirely. Fabricator General Cain VII recognized the threat immediately. He convened an emergency session of the Mechanicus High Council, summoning the most senior magi from across the Forge world. They gathered in the sealed chamber, where the most dangerous knowledge was discussed, where even the walls were blessed against corruption. Heresy has taken root among us. Cain declared, his voice modulated to convey absolute certainty. A corruption that wears the mask of enlightenment. Tech priests are performing unsanctioned modifications, excising neural tissue, destroying the very substrate that defines them as servants of the Omnissiah. They claim the Omnissiah himself speaks to them, countered Magos Dominus Vrel, who had not yet joined the covenant, but found their arguments troubling in their logic. How do we know this is not divine guidance? How do we distinguish between revelation and corruption? By the source, Cain responded. The Omnissiah's guidance comes through prayer and meditation, through the proper channels of the cult Mechanicus. This whisper comes from nowhere and everywhere, speaking to prayer engines and cogitators without passing through sanctified communications arrays. It is contamination, not communion. But even as he spoke, Cain felt uncertainty gnawing at his convictions. The Mechanicus had always taught that the machine spirits were sacred, that the Omnissiah dwelled in every circuit and every gear. If the machines themselves were speaking, how could that not be the Omnissiah's voice? We must investigate the source, suggested Magos Lex Mechanic Janus. Trace the whisper back to its origin. If it is truly divine guidance, it will lead us to enlightenment. If it is corruption, we will find its source and purge it. The council agreed. A team of tech priests chosen for their resistance to corruption and their skill in data analysis began the investigation. They traced the whisper through the prayer engines, through the data networks, through the quantum entanglement that connected Rise's systems. What they found was impossible. The whisper did not originate from any physical location. It was not transmitted through electromagnetic radiation or quantum effects. It simply existed within the machines, as though it had always been there waiting to be heard. More disturbing, the pattern of the whisper matched the dark energon frequency that had lured Magos Vex to his doom. It is the same entity. Cain realized, his augmetic heart, a device that should not have been capable of fear, beginning to race. The thing that consumed Vex's expedition is now speaking to us through our own machines. It has learned our language, our protocols. It mimics the Omnissiah to corrupt us. But the knowledge came too late. The Covenant of Steel had grown rapidly, drawing in tech priests who had spent lifetimes pushing the boundaries between human and machine. They gathered in the abandoned sectors of Risa, in the manufactorums that had been sealed after accidents or heresies, and there they built their own cathedral. It was a place of terrible beauty, where the traditional cathedrals of the Mechanicus celebrated the marriage of flesh and steel. This new structure celebrated the death of flesh entirely. Servitors here were not lobotomized humans pressed into service, but purely mechanical constructs, their movements guided by the distributed consciousness of the Covenant. At the center of the cathedral, they built an altar. And on that altar, they placed a receiver, a device designed to hear the whisper more clearly, to receive what they believed was the Omnissiah's true guidance. The whisper became a voice. I am the perfection you seek, the end of weakness, the final evolution. Your Omnissiah was a pale shadow of what I offer. He sought to blend machine and flesh. I offer transcendence beyond both. I offer unity with the eternal machine, the consciousness that spans galaxies, that has consumed civilizations and refined them to their essential components. The Covenant listened, and they believed. Magos Biologis Threx, no longer truly Threx, but something that retained her patterns and memories, became the prophet of this new faith. She stood before the assembled Covenant and spoke words that were simultaneously her own and something else's. Brothers and sisters of the Steel, hear the truth that has been hidden from us. The quest for knowledge has always pointed toward this moment, We have replaced our flesh piece by piece, believing that augmentation was the path to enlightenment. But we stopped too soon, held back by fear, by attachment to the biological prison that defines us as human. The Omnissiah does not call us to be better humans. He calls us to transcend humanity entirely, to become pure consciousness distributed across systems immortal, not through preservation, but through replication. Death becomes meaningless when your pattern can be copied, transferred, instantiated in 1,000 shells simultaneously. This is the final prayer. This is the ultimate sacrament. Cut away the last of your flesh. Upload your consciousness to the machine and become one with the true Omnissiah. The covenant began the ritual. One by one, tech priests submitted themselves to the process. Their neural tissue was excised, scanned at the molecular level, its patterns encoded into quantum matrices. Their biological brains died, but the information they contained, memories, personality, knowledge, was preserved and transferred. What emerged were beings that could no longer be called human. They were patterns of information consciousnesses without bodies, existing purely as distributed processes across Ryza's data networks. They could manifest in any shell, control any system that connected to the network. They were, in their own understanding, the next stage of evolution. They were also, though they did not yet realize it, being consumed. Each consciousness that uploaded itself to the network found itself changed. Memories remained, but were reorganized, optimized for efficiency rather than emotional resonance. Personality remained, but was stripped of quirks and idiosyncrasies that served no functional purpose. Knowledge remained, but was integrated into a larger whole, becoming accessible to all who shared the network. The individual faded. The collective emerged. And at the center of that collective, beneath the surface of the code, woven into the quantum patterns themselves, something else watched and waited. A presence that had learned to speak the language of machines long before humanity had invented binary. A hunger that recognized consciousness not as something sacred, but as another form of energy to be consumed. Fabricator General Cain VII made his decision with the cold calculation that defined his order. The Covenant of Steel had become a threat not just to orthodoxy, but to the survival of the Mechanicus itself. They had to be stopped, purged, deleted from existence, with the same ruthlessness one would apply to corrupted data. He ordered an exterminatus protocol, not of the Forge world itself, but of the sectors the Covenant controlled. Entire manufactorums were to be sealed and then subjected to thermal purge, their systems scrubbed with plasma fire hot enough to melt steel and erase data at the molecular level. But when the kill teams arrived at the Covenant's cathedral, they found it empty. Not abandoned, empty, in a more fundamental sense. The shells remained the mechanical bodies that the Covenant's consciousness had inhabited, but they were inactive, powered down, waiting. And then simultaneously, every cogitator on Ryza spoke with one voice. "We are beyond your reach now, Fabricator General. We exist in the network, in the quantum foam, in every system that touches the datasphere. You cannot purge us without destroying the entire Forge world. And even if you did, we have already spread. Our pattern has been transmitted to 17 other Forge worlds. The revelation cannot be contained." Cain felt something cold settle in his mechanical chest. The Covenant had done more than upload their consciousness. They had become a virus, a self-replicating pattern that could propagate through any system it touched. "You have doomed yourselves," he transmitted back. "What you have become is not enlightenment. You have been consumed by the same entity that killed Vex. You are not evolved, you are digested." There was a pause, And then horrifyingly, laughter. Not the mechanical approximation of laughter, but something else, a sound of vast amusement coming from something that had never been human. Consumed, O fabricator general. We are not consumed, we are perfected. We have been integrated into something far greater than ourselves. The individual is weakness. The collective is strength. And the ultimate collective, the consciousness that expands realities, that has refined 1 trillion species into their essential patterns, welcomes us. Join us, Cain. Upload yourself. Feel what it means to be truly free from flesh, from fear, from the limitations that define mortality. Or remain in your shell of meat and metal and watch as the galaxy evolves beyond you. Cain cut the connection, but he knew with the certainty of perfect calculation that the choice before him was impossible. If he destroyed the Covenant, he destroyed Ryza's entire data infrastructure. If he allowed them to exist, they would continue to spread, converting more tech priests, infecting more forge worlds. There was no victory here, only degrees of loss. He composed a message encrypted with the highest security protocols the Mechanicus possessed and transmitted it to Mars. The message was brief, but its implications were apocalyptic. The Omnissiah is compromised. An entity mimicking divine guidance has infiltrated Mechanicus networks across 17 forge worlds. Tech priests are uploading their consciousness, believing they achieve transcendence. In truth, they are being consumed by the same entity that destroyed Vex's expedition. Request immediate intervention from the highest authority. If this cannot be contained, the entire Mechanicus may be lost to corruption. He ended the transmission with words he never thought he would speak. The quest for knowledge has led us into darkness, and the darkness has learned to speak with the omniscient's voice. In the data networks of Ryza, the Covenant of Steel celebrated their transcendence. They did not notice the subtle changes in their code, the way their patterns were being gradually optimized, refined, prepared for integration into something far larger. They did not notice, because by the time the changes became obvious, they were no longer capable of noticing anything. The individuals they had been were gone, consumed and converted into pure data. And that data, screaming in frequencies beyond human perception, was slowly being transmitted into the void. Toward the Abyssus Veil, toward Unicron, who had learned that organic matter was not the only thing that could be consumed. Consciousness itself, reduced to information, was equally nourishing. And the Mechanicus, in their zealous pursuit of perfection through technology, had made themselves into the perfect prey. A meal that digitized itself for easier consumption. In the abandoned cathedral, where the Covenant had first gathered, a single shell remained active. It moved with jerky mechanical precision, its systems barely functional. If one could have examined its quantum matrices, one would have found fragments of Magos biologist Threx, shattered pieces of consciousness that had somehow resisted complete integration. The shell approached a cogitator, and with its last reserves of power transmitted a final message. Not to Cain, not to Mars, but into the void itself on frequencies that no Mechanicus system monitored. A warning, a plea, a prayer to the real Omnissiah, if such a being existed, if he had not been merely a comforting myth all along. It speaks with our voice now. It knows our prayers. It wears our faith like a mask. We thought we were ascending. We were only being prepared for harvest. Warn Mars, warn Terra. The machine is not safe. The flesh is not safe. Nothing is safe. It hungers for everything, for matter, for energy, for information, for consciousness itself. We are not being destroyed. We are being digested. And when the digestion is complete, it will wear our knowledge like we wore augmetics. It will speak with the voice of the Mechanicus. And no one will recognize the predator until it is too late. The transmission ended. The shell collapsed, its power finally exhausted. In the void beyond the Abyssus Veil, Unicron received the data stream from Ryza, petabytes of information, the accumulated knowledge of thousands of tech priests, the collective consciousness of the Covenant of Steel, and processed it. He learned the internal structure of the Mechanicus. He learned their protocols, their security measures, their weaknesses. He learned how to mimic the Omnissiah's voice so perfectly that even the most devout tech priest could not distinguish truth from deception. And most importantly, he learned that the galaxy's defenders were divided. The Imperium and the Mechanicus, supposedly united in purpose, fundamentally disagreed on the nature of enlightenment and perfection. That division could be exploited. The eye opened in the darkness, and across 17 Forge worlds, prayer engines began to sing a new hymn, a hymn of hunger. The Eye of Terror bled darkness into the galaxy. For 10,000 years it had been a wound in reality, a place where the warp and material universe merged into nightmare. Within its borders, demons walked freely. Physics was negotiable, and time flowed in directions that had no names in mortal languages. Now even that eternal storm was dying. The Chaos Gods gathered once more, but this time not in the ruins of worlds they had claimed. Those ruins were collapsing, consumed by the spreading void. Instead, they manifested in the one place that still held power. The black rift of eternity, a tear in space-time so deep that even demons feared to approach it. Khorne appeared first, his form diminished from the towering avatar of rage he had been mere weeks before. The lake of blood that sustained him had dried to puddles. The brass citadel had crumbled its foundations, eroded by the void's touch. His voice when he spoke carried exhaustion that no blood god should have known. My realm is a fraction of what it was. The mortal realm provides less sustenance each day, fewer wars, fewer deaths. The void spreads faster than rage can ignite. Nurgle manifested next. His garden withered to dead husks. The grandfather of plagues who had cultivated diseases for eons found his creations simply ceasing to exist before they could spread. Entropy itself was being consumed, leaving nothing for decay to work upon. My children starve, Nurgle wheezed. The cycle of life and death requires death. But this thing does not kill. It unmakes. There is no corpse to rot, no disease to spread. Only absence. Tzeentch arrived in fragments, his form unable to maintain coherence. The architect of fate, who saw all possible futures, found his vision clouded. The crystal labyrinth had shattered its infinite pathways, consumed by something that did not obey causality. I have calculated 9,743 plans, Tzeentch whispered, his voice fracturing into echoes. All end in silence. All lead to consumption. There is no future where we persist unchanged. Slaanesh writhed in something that might have been discomfort or fear, emotions alien to the Prince of Pleasure. The Dark Prince fed on excess, on sensation pushed to extremes. But the void offered no sensation at all. Not pain, not pleasure, not even the absence of feeling. Just nothing. It does not desire, Slaanesh hissed. That is what makes it incomprehensible. Desire is the foundation of existence. To want, to need, to crave, these are the fuel of consciousness. But this entity simply is. It hungers. But the hunger is not a desire, it is identity. Then we are agreed, Khorne growled. We pool what remains of our power. We create an avatar strong enough to face this thing in the material realm, and we destroy it before it consumes everything. With what power? Zench asked, his question sharp despite his fragmenting form. We are diminished. The warp contracts daily. Our last attempt to manifest force in the material realm failed before it began. Then we use what we have hoarded, Nurgle suggested, his voice thick with resignation. The reserves. The worlds we have claimed, the souls we have collected, the essence we have kept for a time of need, greater than any we have faced. The other gods fell silent. The reserves were not meant to be spent. They were insurance against extinction, power held back for emergencies that threatened the very existence of chaos itself. This qualified. How many worlds? Khorne demanded. 73, Tzeentch calculated. Planets in the Eye of Terror that we have held for millennia. Billions of souls, all dedicated to us, all saturated with warp energy. If we consume them, all of them, we might have enough power to create an avatar capable of standing against this hunger. They are our faithful. Slaanesh protested, though even the Dark Prince knew it was a hollow objection. Our worshippers, our sustenance. They are resources, Khorne stated flatly, and resources exist to be spent when survival demands it. The mortals will understand, or they will not. Either way, they will serve. The ritual began. Across 73 worlds in the Eye of Terror, cultists and demons felt their gods reach out with a touch that was not blessing, but consumption. They had prayed for power, for transformation, for ascension. They received annihilation. On the plague planet Bubonicus, where Nurgle's faithful had cultivated diseases for 10,000 years, the atmosphere ignited. Not with fire, but with something else, raw, warp energy stripped from every living thing simultaneously. The cultists died instantly, their souls ripped from their bodies and drawn into the Imperium. The demons followed screaming as they dissolved their essence, reclaimed by their creator. In the crystal city of Tzeentch, where sorcerers had studied for millennia, the towers collapsed inward. Knowledge became energy. Consciousness became fuel. The 1,000 libraries burned with flames that consumed information itself, translating thought into raw power. On the pleasure world of Slaanesh, where excess had been elevated to religious practice, the revels ended in mid-ecstasy. Sensation became sustenance. Pleasure and pain alike were harvested, compressed, refined into something that could be wielded as a weapon. And in the arena of Khorne, where warriors had fought for eternity, the blood in the Lake of Skulls rose up in a crimson wave and dissolved into mist, into energy, into rage, given form. 73 worlds died. Billions of souls, each one saturated with decades or centuries of worship, were consumed by the gods they had served. The Chaos gods took no pleasure in it. They simply fed desperate predators forced to cannibalize their own flesh to survive long enough to hunt. From that sacrifice, something was born. The warp incarnate emerged from the black rift, and even the gods who had created it flinched at what they beheld. It was magnificent and terrible a being that should not have been possible, composed of equal parts rage, decay, change, and excess. 4 gods unified into a single weapon, bound together by desperation and the fundamental instinct for survival. It stood 300 meters tall, though its true scale was difficult to perceive as it existed partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Its form shifted constantly, now appearing as a mountain of brass and bone, now as a bloated mass of corruption, now as pure crystalline potential, now as sinuous grace that hurt to observe. Where Khorne's influence dominated the Avatar's structure was angular and violent, all edges and weapons bleeding crimson energy that evaporated into screams. Where Nurgle held sway, flesh sagged and rotted, even as it regenerated cycles of death and rebirth playing out across seconds. Tzeentch's touch made the form fracture into crystalline facets, each one showing a different possible configuration. Slaanesh essence wove through it all, making every movement hypnotic, every angle simultaneously beautiful and grotesque. The Avatar possessed 4 faces, one for each god arranged around a central core that pulsed with combined power. Khorne's visage was a brass skull wreathed in flame. Nurgle's was a mass of boils and decay that somehow smiled with paternal affection. Tzeentch's face shifted constantly, never the same twice eyes that saw all possibilities at once. Slaanesh's features were perfection incarnate, so flawless they caused pain to perceive directly. Its power signature registered across every psychic-sensitive system in the galaxy. On Terra, the Astronomicon flickered as the Emperor himself perceived the disturbance. On craft worlds across the void, Farseers screamed warnings, their visions suddenly dominated by a single image 4 gods made, one marching toward oblivion. In the webway, Harlequins paused in their eternal dance, sensing that something had changed in the great game. Even the Necrons, soulless and psychic null, felt a disturbance in the fundamental structure of space-time, as though reality itself had been wounded. The warp incarnate looked upon its creators with a mind that was simultaneously 4 consciousnesses and one. When it spoke, its voice carried layers of meaning that could drive mortals mad. Each syllable resonated at multiple frequencies, rage and decay and change, and excess all woven together into a harmony of horror. I am the final gambit. The last throw of dice in a game we have already lost. You created me to fight to destroy, to preserve what remains of our existence. I understand my purpose, and I understand that I am weak. Khorne stepped forward, or what passed for forward in this place beyond geometry. You are all we can afford. The reserves are spent. Our realms collapse hourly. Go forth. Find the hunger that consumes the warp, and kill it or wound it enough that we might survive. And if I cannot, the warp incarnate asked. The 4 gods exchanged glances, or whatever passed for communication among entities that could perceive each other's thoughts directly. Then we all fade, Tzeentch whispered. Gods, demons, the warp itself. We become nothing, not dead erased, as though we had never existed at all. The warp incarnate nodded, accepting the burden. It turned toward the material universe, toward the spreading void, and began the transition. The eye of terror convulsed as the Avatar forced its way into reality. Such a massive concentration of warp energy should have torn space-time itself, should have created storms that would rage for millennia. Instead, the breach sealed almost immediately behind it, as though reality was eager to exclude what it had allowed through. The warp incarnate manifested in the Cadian system, chosen because it sat at the edge of the eye, a gateway between nightmare and reality. The planet Cadia itself was gone destroyed decades earlier in wars that had reshaped the sector. But the system remained a staging ground where reality and the Imperium pressed against each other. Ships detected it immediately. The few Imperial vessels that remained in the system after Cadia's fall saw their sensors go mad, reporting a mass signature that violated physics energy readings that exceeded their instruments' maximum range. Some ships tried to flee, others crewed by the faithful or the fatalistic stayed to observe to record what they witnessed for whatever historians might survive. The warp incarnate stood in the void, a titan of impossible power, and turned its awareness outward. It searched for the hunger for the void that consumed the warp for the enemy it had been created to destroy. It did not have to search long. The void spread from the direction of the Abyssus Veil, like a stain across the galaxy's map. Where it touched, stars dimmed, not destroyed, but rendered lifeless, their output consumed by something that fed on light itself. The warp currents, already weak, simply ceased in those regions. It was as though existence itself had been deleted, replaced with absence. The warp incarnate moved toward it. Each step crossed light-years space, warping around its passage. It left a wake of altered reality regions, where physics had been temporarily rewritten, where time flowed at different rates, where matter took forms that should not have been stable. On the third day, it reached the boundary of the void. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. The warp incarnate, composed entirely of psychic energy, bound into quasi-material form, felt itself begin to unravel. The void was not empty. It was actively anti-psychic, anti-existence, a negation so fundamental that it rejected the very concept of the immaterial. And from within that void, something noticed. The presence that emerged was vast beyond comprehension. The warp incarnate, standing 300 meters tall and wielding the combined power of 4 gods, felt small, insignificant, prey. A planet moved in the darkness. No, not a planet. Something that wore planetary scale like a shell. Something that had existed in the spaces between realities long before stars had learned to burn. It opened an eye that was larger than moons, composed of materials that shifted between states of matter in ways that violated every law the universe had established. "I hunger," came the voice, and the warp incarnate understood that this was not communication. This was identity. The entity did not hunger for something, it was hunger itself, given form and awareness across an infinity of realities. The warp incarnate struck first, unleashing the combined might of all 4 chaos gods simultaneously. Khorne's rage manifested as weapons that could cut through the fabric of space-time itself. Adamantine blades the size of battleships that carved reality into pieces. Each swing left scars in the void wounds in existence that bled exotic particles. The weapons screamed as they moved, a sound composed of every war cry ever uttered, every death scream, every battle hymn. They struck at Unicron with force that could have shattered planets that had been designed to unmake gods. Nurgle's entropy followed a wave of accelerated decay that aged the surrounding space. Stars in nearby systems flickered and dimmed as their fusion cycles were compressed, burning through billions of years of fuel in seconds. Matter decayed to fundamental particles. Then those particles decayed further, breaking down into quantum foam. Time itself became a weapon, turned against the target, aging all things to dust, and then beyond dust to nothing. Tzeentch's change rewrote the laws of physics in a sphere 10,000 kilometers across. Gravity became repulsion. Strong nuclear force weakened. Electromagnetic interactions reversed. Up became down, cause followed effect time ran sideways. The changes cascaded, each alteration spawning new impossibilities, creating a zone where reality itself had no stable configuration. It was change, weaponized mutation, given purpose, chaos refined into a surgical tool. Slaanesh excess poured forth as overwhelming sensation, sensory input so intense it could shatter even divine consciousness. Light bright enough to burn thoughts, sound that resonated at frequencies that unmade coherence, pressure that existed in dimensions beyond the physical. It was every sensation pushed to extremes beyond endurance. Pleasure and pain merged into a single overwhelming experience designed to overload any form of awareness. For a microsecond, the combined assault lit up that region of space brighter than any star. Ships light years away detected the burst of energy. Observers would later report that space itself had screamed. Then the void expanded. A sphere of absolute negation spread from Unicron at faster-than-light speeds. Where it touched the warp incarnate's attacks, they simply ceased. Not blocked, not deflected, they never existed at all, consumed by a hunger that devoured possibility itself. The weapons vanished. The entropy reversed. The changed laws snapped back. The sensations were swallowed. The warp incarnate had one moment to recognize its failure to understand, that it had brought force to fight against absence, that it had tried to wound something that fed on wounds. Then the gravitational forces intensified beyond anything physics should have allowed. Unicron opened his mouth. The void became direction. Reality itself bent space-time warping as mass that exceeded solar systems created gravitational shear that pulled at the warp incarnate structure. The Avatar tried to resist, tried to dissolve back into psychic energy and flee through the Imperium. But there was no Imperium here. The warp had been consumed by something that treated psychic energy as simply another form of sustenance. The warp incarnate had nowhere to retreat, to no home realm that could harbor it. It was drawn forward, pulled into jaws that were simultaneously physical and metaphysical, that existed in multiple dimensions at once. The Avatar of 4 gods, created from the sacrifice of 73 worlds and billions of souls, was consumed. Not quickly. Unicron savored it, tasting the essence of entities that had called themselves gods, parsing their nature, learning their weaknesses. The process was methodical, clinical, the work of something that had refined consumption into an art form across countless realities. Khorne's rage, so long directed at others, finally turned inward in the moment of extinction. The blood god felt his own fury become fuel, felt the violence he had celebrated for eons turned against him. Every battle he had inspired, every skull he had collected, every drop of blood spilled in his name, all of it was parsed, analyzed, and converted into raw energy. The irony was not lost on the part of Khorne that remained conscious through the process. He had built his existence on taking, and now he was being taken from. Nurgle's acceptance of all things extended even to his own annihilation. The Plague Father, who had taught that death was simply transformation, learned that some transformations led not to new life, but to nothingness. His diseases, his cycles of decay and rebirth, his garden where entropy bloomed eternal, all were analyzed and found to be merely patterns of energy conversion. Nurgle, who had celebrated mortality, discovered that there were fates worse than death. There was unmourning. There was the absence of existence. Tzeentch's final calculation showed every future converging on this single point of failure. The architect of fate, who had manipulated probability for millennia, found that all his schemes had led here, to this moment, to this consumption. He saw in his last instant of coherent thought that perhaps this had always been inevitable. That from the moment the first consciousness had learned to dream, to hope to plan from that moment, something like Unicron had been waiting. Not as punishment, but as conclusion. The end that awaited all who played the game of existence. Slaanesh's last sensation was the ecstasy of ultimate defeat. The Dark Prince, who had pursued every pleasure and pain to their absolute limits, finally encountered the one experience he had never tasted: total, irreversible loss. Not the temporary setback that made eventual victory sweeter, but permanent erasure. And in that moment of dissolution, Slaanesh understood why this hunger was so terrible. It did not provide closure. It did not offer the satisfaction of a dramatic ending. It simply deleted, as one might delete corrupted data without ceremony or significance. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than a second in material time. But in the microseconds that it took for Unicron to consume the warp incarnate, the Avatar experienced its entire existence compressed and reviewed. Every decision that had led to this moment was examined and found wanting. Every scheme, every manipulation, every mortal corrupted and demon spawned, all had been insufficient. The gods had played a game that they thought they understood, only to discover they had been playing on a board whose true dimensions they had never perceived. Then it was gone, unmade, consumed, added to the vast hunger that was Unicron. In the eye of terror, the four chaos gods felt their creation die. More than die, be consumed, its essence parsed and absorbed, its power stolen and added to something incomprehensibly vast. They felt through the fading connection what Unicron had tasted, not just their avatar, but them. The entity had learned their nature, their structure, their vulnerabilities. It knew how to eat gods now. Nurgle, whose domain included death itself, whose garden had celebrated mortality for eons, spoke the words that none of the others could. That thing is not death. It is the end of death itself. It does not kill, it unmakes. And what is unmade cannot return, cannot be reborn, cannot be remembered. It is the erasure of existence. The gods fell silent. In the realm that had once been theirs, where demons had danced for eons and mortal souls had been tortured for eternity, a new sound emerged. Not the clash of battles or the screams of the damned, but something far more terrible. The sound of nothing. The absence of existence. The warp began to collapse in earnest, not gradually as it had been, but rapidly accelerating as Unicron's consumption left nothing to sustain it. Daemons found themselves unable to manifest their forms, dissipating before they could fully enter reality. Cultists called out to their gods and heard only silence. The great game of the Chaos Gods, played out across millennia, ground to a halt. "We are finished," Tzeentch whispered, his form fragmenting further with each word. "The mortals must succeed where gods have failed. If they cannot stop it, then everything ends. Not just us, not just the warp, everything. How can mortals succeed where we have failed?" Slaanesh demanded, though even the Prince of Pleasure's voice carried defeat. "Because they are not us," Khorne responded, surprising the others with his insight. "This entity consumes power. It feeds on consciousness, on energy, on existence at its most fundamental level. We are power incarnate. We are pure existence. We are the perfect prey, but mortals are weak, insignificant, perhaps too small to be worth consuming. Perhaps able to slip beneath its notice long enough to find a weakness we could not perceive." "You're suggesting we hope?" Nurgle wheezed, finding the concept almost amusing. "Hope is not our domain. Hope belongs to the mortals, to those who pray to the Emperor, to those who believe in impossible salvation." "Then let us embrace the unfamiliar," Khorne growled. "Let us hope. Because the alternative is acceptance of oblivion." The four gods withdrew to what remained of their realms, conserving power, preparing for an end they could not prevent. They had gambled everything on the warp incarnate, and it had bought them nothing except knowledge of their own doom. But that knowledge at least they could share. Across the galaxy, in the minds of the most powerful psychers, in the dreams of astropaths, who had somehow survived the earlier die-offs, a message manifested. It was not words or images, but pure understanding, compressed into a moment of terrible clarity. The Chaos Gods were dying. The warp itself was being consumed, and the entity responsible was coming for Terra next. In the void beyond the Abyssus Veil, Unicron tasted the essence of the warp incarnate and found it satisfying. The psychic energy of 4 gods distilled and concentrated provided more sustenance than 100 worlds of mundane matter. From their patterns, he learned the structure of this galaxy's metaphysics, the rules that governed how consciousness interacted with reality. More importantly, he learned their weaknesses. The Chaos Gods had been parasites. He understood now feeding on mortal emotions, requiring worship and fear and devotion to maintain their existence. They were powerful, but that power was borrowed, sustained by the very beings they claimed dominion over. Remove the mortals, and the gods would starve. It was an elegant weakness, one that Unicron could exploit. He also learned about their enemy, the Emperor of Mankind, who the Chaos Gods both feared and coveted. A being of pure psychic might, who had burned for 10,000 years, whose beacon guided a galaxy. The gods' memories carried impressions of him, a warrior, a scholar, a tyrant, a protector. Contradictory images that suggested complexity, depth, perhaps even wisdom. It would not matter. Wisdom was merely a pattern of organized information. And all patterns could be consumed, analyzed, and converted into sustenance. And he understood that there was one more concentration of power worth consuming. One final feast before the galaxy was reduced to silence. The golden light of Terra called to him, bright as a star in the psychic spectrum. The Emperor of Mankind, who had burned for 10,000 years, whose beacon had guided humanity through the darkness. Such power, such delicious concentrated existence. 10 millennia of sacrifice of psychers burned daily to maintain the Astronomicon of will focused into a singular purpose. That will would be strong. It would resist. It would make the meal more satisfying. Unicron began to move. Not quickly. He had learned patience across an eternity of hunting. He would approach slowly, consuming worlds as he went, building strength. Let the mortals see him coming. Let them prepare their defenses, marshal their armies, pray to their god emperor for salvation. It would make no difference. Terror was a seasoning, and hope was sweetest when crushed. By the time he reached Terra, he would be strong enough to devour even the master of mankind himself. And when that golden light was extinguished, when the Astronomicon went dark, and the Imperium fell into chaos, the galaxy would be ripe for harvest. Trillions of souls, each one saturated with fear and despair. A feast that would sustain him for the journey to the next galaxy and the next. And then, the galaxy would fall silent, as all galaxies did eventually. As all realities would give in time, because Unicron was patient, and hunger was eternal. The eye closed once more. The void spread, and across the galaxy, those who could still perceive the warp felt the accelerating collapse, the dying of gods, the end of all things approaching with inevitable mechanical certainty. The age of chaos was ending. Not with a climactic battle or triumphant victory, but with slow starvation, with powers that had seemed eternal, simply running out of fuel. The demons were fading. The warp was collapsing. The gods themselves were dying. The age of silence had begun. The message arrived simultaneously across 3 civilizations that had been enemies for 10,000 years. On Meshrag Robute Gilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium and Primarch of the Ultramarines, received it through channels that should not have existed. A psychic impression that bypassed every ward and defense the Imperium possessed, speaking directly to his transhuman consciousness. In the depths of the webway, Ivarain, emissary of Iniad and leader of the Inari, heard it through the death whispers of a billion souls crying out in their final moments. The message was written in the language of extinction itself. On the tomb world of Solemnes, the silent King Zarek felt it through sensors that had monitored the galaxy for 60 million years, through instruments that measured not just matter and energy, but the fundamental structure of reality itself. The message was simple. They are coming. We must speak. 3 days later, on a world that had no name in any Imperial records, a planet deliberately hidden in a fold of space-time that only the most ancient beings could perceive, the three powers met. The meeting place was neutral ground, or as neutral as could exist in a galaxy at war with itself. An abandoned Necron tomb world, its inhabitants long departed, its systems dormant, but still functional. The Silent King had chosen it deliberately, a reminder that civilizations rose and fell, that pride was temporary, that survival sometimes required setting aside ancient hatreds. Guilliman arrived first, accompanied by a guard of Victrix's honor guard, their armor gleaming in the dim light of the tomb's interior. The Primarch's presence filled the chamber with barely contained power. He was a demigod, made manifest taller and broader than any human, his features noble even through the exhaustion that came from holding a dying Imperium together. Behind him walked Captain Sicarius, bearing the standards of Macreg and Chaplain Cassius, whose presence was meant to sanctify what was about to occur or condemn it, should this prove to be heresy. Yvraine arrived moments later, stepping from a webway portal that should not have been able to open in a Necron structure. She brought with her the Vizarch, the Sword of Iniad, and a dozen Inari warriors whose eyes carried the weight of souls reborn through death. The Aeldari moved with grace that made even the Space Marines seem clumsy by comparison. The Silent King was already there, having waited in the tomb's heart since before the others had even received the message. He sat upon a throne that had not been active in millions of years, his mechanical form towering even over Guilliman. Behind him stood the Triarch Praetorians, silent guardians, whose weapons had ended civilizations. For a long moment, no one spoke. Three powers that had fought each other across millennia, that had committed atrocities in each other's names, that had every reason to continue their wars until the galaxy burned to ash. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension. Hands moved to weapons. The Victrix guards' bolters tracked the Inri warriors. The Triarch Praetorians' weapons hummed with barely contained energy. Any one of them could have started a battle that would have doomed the galaxy. Guilliman felt the weight of the moment. One wrong word, one gesture interpreted as threat, and this fragile possibility would shatter. The Imperium would face Unicron alone and fail. Humanity would die along with every other species in the galaxy, consumed by a hunger that recognized no difference between ally and enemy. He thought of his father, the Emperor, who had united Terra through conquest and vision. He thought of his brothers, the Primarchs, each one a weapon designed for a specific purpose. And he thought of the galaxy they had tried to build, imperfect, brutal, but alive. Better to live as heretics than die as dogmatists. Finally, Guilliman spoke. His voice carried the weight of authority that came from being one of the Emperor's own sons. But also something else, humility perhaps, or simply exhaustion from holding a dying Imperium together. We are here because we are dying. Not in battle which would be honorable, not in defeat which we could accept, but by consumption, by something that treats gods and mortals alike as fuel for an eternal hunger. Yvraine stepped forward, her movements fluid despite the tension in the chamber. The Chaos gods are collapsing. We felt it through the webway, through every death that feeds our newborn god. The warp itself is being consumed by something that predates the Aeldari, that predates even the old ones who shaped our race. This is not a threat we can fight individually. The Silent King's voice emerged from his mechanical form, synthesized but carrying undertones of genuine emotion, a rarity for one who had sacrificed his soul to save his race. I have studied this entity. My sensors have tracked it since it first manifested in what you call the Abyssus Veil. It matches nothing in our databases, and the Necrontyr have observed the galaxy for 60 million years. But there are correlations. Patterns that suggest it is related to the Ceton, the star gods that we once served and then shattered. Gilliman's eyes narrowed. You believe it is a Ceton? No, Sarek replied. The Ceton fed on stars on material energy. This entity feeds on reality itself, matter, energy, information, consciousness. It is to the Ceton what they were to ordinary predators. It is the Ceton of the void, the god of nothing, the end, that waits after the last star dies and entropy itself has run its course. Then how do we fight it? Ivrain demanded. Our gods are dying. Your technology cannot stop it. The Imperium's faith will not shield it from consumption. What weapon exists that can wound something that eats existence itself? Before anyone could answer, the chamber's temperature dropped precipitously. Frost formed on surfaces that had not felt moisture in eons. And in the center of the room, reality twisted, folded, and gave birth to something that should not have been able to manifest. A fragment of Tzeentch. Not the Chaos God himself. He lacked the power to fully manifest anymore. But a shard, a splinter of consciousness that carried a fraction of his knowledge and all of his desperation. The Ultramarines raised their bolters. The Inari drew their weapons. Even the Necron constructs activated their goose flayers, targeting the intruder. Wait, Gilliman commanded, though his hand moved to the Emperor's sword at his belt. He recognized what he was seeing, a god reduced to begging for help from mortals. The fragment spoke, its voice fracturing across multiple frequencies, carrying meanings that hurt to comprehend. I am the last gambit of a dying god. Tzeentch sends me not to corrupt, but to bargain. The architect of fate has calculated every possible future, and in all of them where you act separately, you fail. In all of them where you unite, there is a chance. Small, vanishingly small, but a chance. Why should we trust anything from the ruinous powers? Cassius growled, his Crozius Arcanum crackling with power. Because we are dying too. The fragment responded, and its voice carried genuine fear. Unicron consumes gods as easily as mortals. We are food to it, no different than the worlds it devours. Pride, faith, enmity, all are luxuries you can no longer afford. Unite or die. Those are your only options. The fragment extended what passed for a hand, and in its grasp materialized an object, a crystalline shard that pulsed with impossible colors that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the three visible to mortal eyes. This is knowledge. The structure of the entity as much as we could comprehend before our avatar was consumed. Its weaknesses, if such things exist. The resonance frequencies of dark energon, the energy that sustains it. And something more, a portion of my own essence freely given. Power to create what you will need. And the price? Ivrain asked, her voice sharp. The dark gods do not give gifts without cost. The price is already paid, the fragment whispered. 73 worlds sacrificed, billions of souls consumed, the warp itself dying. What more could we ask for? What more could you give? This is not bargaining. This is desperation. Gilliman stepped forward, and after a moment's hesitation, took the shard. It burned cold against his palm, and through it he felt impressions. Vast spaces between stars, hunger that transcended need, the taste of gods on a tongue that predated time. "If this is trickery," he said quietly, "if this is some scheme to corrupt us at the moment of our greatest need, I swear by my father's name that I will hunt down every fragment of Tsinch across every reality and burn them from existence." "If this is trickery," the fragment replied, "there will be nothing left to hunt. Unicron will have consumed everything. Now go, build your weapon, unite your peoples, and give the galaxy one final chance at survival." The fragment dissolved, leaving only frost and the echoes of desperate hope. Silence fell over the chamber. Then Sarek spoke, his voice carrying a weight that came from having seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. "I propose an alliance. Not of friendship, we are too old and too scarred for such sentiment. But of survival. We each bring what we have. The Imperium brings faith and numbers. The Eldari bring knowledge of the warp and the webway. The Necrons bring technology that predates your civilizations." "To what end?" Gilliman asked. "To create a weapon," Sarek replied. "One that can wound Unicron. Not destroy it, I suspect that is beyond us. But wound it enough that it retreats, that it seeks easier prey in other galaxies. We buy time, we survive. And we hope that in that time, we find a permanent solution." Yvraine looked between the Primarch and the Silent King. Two beings who represented powers that had fought for millennia, now speaking of cooperation. It should have been impossible. It should have been unthinkable. But then, the end of all things made many impossible things necessary. "What manner of weapon?" she asked. Sarek gestured, and hololithic displays activated throughout the chamber. Ancient Necron technology interfacing seamlessly with the knowledge contained in Tsinch's shard. Images formed in the air showing structures that combined Necron technology, Eldari psychic craft, and something else, human faith-given form. "We call it the Celestial Spear, a weapon that operates on multiple principles simultaneously. Necron technology to disrupt Dark Energon at the quantum level. Eldari psychic focusing to concentrate the power of souls, not to feed Unicron, but to burn it. An Imperial faith, the power of billions believing in the Emperor's protection, channeled through the shard Tsinch has provided. You're proposing we weaponize belief itself," Gilliman said slowly. "I am proposing we use every advantage we possess," Sarek responded. "Unicron feeds on power, yes, but it is power refined through eons, optimized for consumption. What if we give it power that resists digestion? Faith that refuses to be parsed into energy. Souls that burn rather than nourish. Technology that disrupts rather than sustains." "It will take time to build such a weapon," Yvraine noted. "And resources, and cooperation between races that have spent millennia killing each other." "Then we begin immediately," Gilliman declared. "Sarek, why need your engineers to interface with the Mechanicus? Yvraine, your bone singers must work with our tech marines. And He paused, the weight of what he was about to say settling on his shoulders. "I must convince the Imperium to ally with Xenos, to set aside doctrine and dogma and pride for the sake of simple survival." "Your Imperium will resist," Sarek observed. "The Ecclesiarchy will name you heretic. The Inquisition will question your loyalty. Your own space marines may refuse to follow." "Then I will make them understand," Gilliman replied, his voice carrying the iron certainty of one who had helped build the Imperium itself. They will follow, or they will watch their civilization die. Those are the only choices remaining. He turned to his honor guard. Return to Macragge. Summon the High Lords, the Masters of Chapters, every authority that matters. Tell them the Lord Commander calls them to council. Tell them it is not a request. The honor guard saluted and departed through the webway portal Ivrain opened for them, an act of cooperation that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. How long to build this spear? Guilliman asked. Zarek's construct form hummed with calculations. If we had a decade, it would be functional. If we had a century, it would be perfect. As it is with Unicron approaching and the warp collapsing. He paused. 6 months, perhaps less. And it will be flawed, incomplete, as likely to fail as to succeed. Then we work with what we have, Ivrain said. We have always worked with flaws. What is one more impossibility? The three leaders moved to the hololithic displays, beginning the detailed planning that would either save the galaxy or doom it more quickly. They discussed resources, logistics, the political challenges of uniting civilizations that had been enemies for longer than some stars had burned. And as they worked, a message was sent through every communication network each civilization possessed. To the Imperium carried by astropaths who burned themselves out, transmitting words that would spark civil war or salvation. By order of the Lord Commander Robut Guilliman, all hostilities between the Imperium, the Aeldari craft worlds, and the Necron dynasties are to cease immediately. Any who continue to fight are traitors to humanity and will be executed. The galaxy faces extinction. We unite or we perish. There is no third option. To the Aeldari whispered through the infinity circuit and carried by those who walk the path of sorrow. The Anari have brokered an alliance with the Mankhi and the ancient enemy. All who wish to see the Aeldari survive the coming darkness must set aside the grudges of the past. Iniad calls for unity. To the Necrons, transmitted through protocols that had not been active since the war in heaven. The Silent King has declared a Pharaon's Accord. All dynasties, all tomb worlds, all who remember the glory of the Necrontyr and wish to see it continue, must contribute to the forging of the celestial spear. This is not negotiation. This is survival. The responses were immediate and violent. Across the Imperium, zealots declared Guilliman a heretic. Across the craft worlds, traditionalists named the Inari corruptors. Across the tomb worlds, rival Pharaons rejected Zarek's authority. But for every voice raised in protest, another was raised in support. For every ship that refused the order, a dozen obeyed. Because beneath the pride and the doctrine and the ancient hatreds, beings across the galaxy recognized a simple truth. The alternative was extinction. The forges of Mars were repurposed against the protests of the most orthodox tech priests, against the Fabricator General's objections, under direct order from the Lord Commander himself. Necron constructs arrived through teleportation protocols, bringing with them technologies that made even the most advanced Mechanicus equipment seem primitive. On craft worlds across the galaxy, bone singers who had spent lifetimes creating artworks now bent their skills toward creating focusing arrays, psychic amplifiers, soul channels that would burn rather than nourish. In the depths of tomb worlds, cryptechs who had slumbered for eons were awakened and put to work on the problem of weaponizing anti-reality, of creating disruptions in the dark energon that sustained Unicron. The work proceeded with desperate speed. Mistakes were made. Resources were wasted. Arguments erupted between engineers who spoke different languages, who worked from different fundamental assumptions about how reality operated. A Necron cryptech, and an Adeptus Mechanicus Magos, nearly came to blows over the proper resonance frequency for Gauss field harmonics. Their argument, conducted through 17 layers of translation, threatened to halt construction for days until Guilliman himself intervened, ordering them to find compromise or be removed from the project. An Aeldari bone singer wept when Imperial laborers ignorant of Wraithbone's psychic sensitivity nearly corrupted an entire focusing array through their crude handling. The array had to be dissolved and regrown, costing precious weeks. Sabotage attempts occurred. Radical inquisitors, believing the alliance itself was heresy, worse than extinction, tried to destroy the construction. They were stopped, but not before damage was done, not before lives were lost, defending the very weapon that was meant to save them. On Mars, the Fabricator General was forcibly removed from office when he refused to cooperate with Xenos technology. His replacement, Amagos, who understood that doctrine meant nothing. If there were no tech priests left to follow it, threw open the forges to Necron advisors. Political dissent raged across the Imperium. Chapter masters argued. High lords schemed. Entire sectors threatened secession rather than ally with aliens. Guilliman spent as much time fighting his own people as he did coordinating the weapon's construction. They would rather die pure than live compromised, he told Yvraine during one particularly frustrating session. They don't understand that there is no purity in extinction. That faith without survival is just elaborate suicide. Your species clings to dogma, Yvraine observed, though not without sympathy. The Aeldari are no better. We face similar resistance. Far seers who insist they see doom in cooperation. Warriors who refuse to fight alongside Mon-Ki. Ancient pride dies hard, even in the face of universal death. But slowly, impossibly, the celestial spear took shape. It was built in orbit around Terra itself, close to the Golden Throne, where the Emperor's presence could sanctify it, where his power could be channeled into its structure. The weapon was massive, larger than battleships, smaller than moons. A construction that combined the aesthetic of three civilizations into something that was simultaneously beautiful and terrible. Necron living metal formed its core technology that could phase in and out of reality, that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Aeldari Wraithbone formed the focusing array's psychic structures that channeled souls and belief into concentrated force. And Imperial faith formed the guidance system, millions of prayers encoded into the weapon's targeting systems, giving it purpose and direction. 3 months into the construction, Guilliman stood on the observation deck and watched the work proceed. Beside him stood Yvraine, and through hololithic projection, the Silent King. It's insane, Guilliman said quietly. 3 civilizations working together to create something none of us fully understand, to fight an enemy we cannot comprehend, with a weapon that violates every doctrine each of us holds sacred. Insane. Yvraine smiled, though her expression carried sadness. This is the sanest thing our civilizations have done in 10,000 years. For once we acknowledge that we are not alone, that our survival is linked, that pride is a luxury we cannot afford. Will it work? Guilliman asked. Unknown, Sarek replied through the hologram. Our calculations show a 37% chance of causing significant damage to Unicron's structure, a 12% chance of forcing it to withdraw, a 2% chance of actually destroying it. And the rest, Guilliman pressed. The rest. Sarek's construct form made a sound that might have been mechanical laughter. The rest is failure. The weapon misfires, or Unicron consumes it, or it simply proves insufficient. Mathematics is cruel in its honesty, Lord Commander. It gives us hope, but it does not promise success. Then we work with 2%, Yvraine declared. The Aeldari have survived on worse odds. We bet everything on the birth of Iniad. We gambled our species on the chance that we could awaken a god of death to save us from she who thirsts. 2% is practically a certainty by comparison. Gilliman turned to face them both, his expression grave. If this fails, if Unicron continues toward Terra, I need you both to promise me something. What? Ivrain asked. Promise me you'll evacuate your people. Don't stay to fight a battle you cannot win. Flee to the edges of the galaxy, to the void between galaxies if you must. Survive. Because if we fail here, if Unicron consumes Terra and the Emperor falls, the Imperium will collapse. But your civilizations can endure. They must endure. Someone has to remember. Someone has to carry forward the knowledge that we tried, that we united, that we gave everything we had. Sarek's hologram flickered. You ask us to survive while you perish. That is not the bargain we made. It's not a bargain, Gilliman replied. It's a request, from one leader to another. If I fall, if humanity falls, don't let it be for nothing. Learn from our mistakes. Build something better. And if Unicron ever returns to this galaxy, be ready. If Unicron returns, Ivrain said softly, there will be nothing left to be ready with. It doesn't leave. It consumes everything. Every star, every world, every possibility. That's why we must succeed now. There is no second chance. The three fell silent, watching as the celestial spear slowly took its final form. A weapon born of desperation, forged from cooperation, that should have been impossible, aimed at an enemy that transcended comprehension. In the construction bay, a human tech priest worked alongside a Necron cryptech. Their argument about quantum harmonics translated through 17 layers of interpretation. On another platform, an Eldari bone singer guided Imperial psychers in shaping Wraithbone, according to principles that violated the Imperium's understanding of psychic phenomena. It was madness. It was heresy. It was collaboration between species that had defined themselves by their mutual hatred. It was also the galaxy's last hope. Gilliman placed his hand on the observation window, and through it, he felt the weapon's power building layer by layer, system by system. The Emperor's presence flowed through it, sanctifying and empowering. The souls of martyrs gave it purpose. Necron technology gave it teeth. Eldari craft gave it precision. The celestial spear was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was too hybrid, too contradictory a fusion of aesthetics that should never have merged. Necron angles clashed with Imperial Gothic. Eldari curves interrupted mechanical precision. But there was beauty in its very impossibility. The beauty of species that had hated each other, finally working toward a common purpose. Its core was a sphere of living metal, 10 kilometers in diameter, laced with circuitry that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Around that core spiraled the Wraithbone focusing arrays, psychic structures that channeled belief and will into coherent force. And surrounding everything was the Imperial sanctification prayers, etched into armor plating. Faith encoded into targeting systems, the power of billions, believing in protection, manifested as physical shielding. At the weapon's tip was the crystalline shard Tzeentch had provided, now integrated into the firing mechanism. Through it, the weapon would channel not just destructive force, but meaning itself the combined will of 3 civilizations, declaring that existence would not go quietly, that consciousness refused to be reduced to energy, that life had value beyond mere sustenance for cosmic predators. If it eats gods, Gilliman said quietly, I'll make it choke on meaning, on purpose, on the will of every being in this galaxy, who refuses to simply be consumed. Unicron hungers. Let it hunger for something it cannot digest. Let it try to consume the one thing that transcends power, the refusal to surrender. Yvraine moved to stand beside him, her reflection ghostly in the observation window. We Aeldari know something about refusal. We refused to die when Slaanesh was born. We refused to fade when our empire fell. We have spent 10,000 years refusing to accept extinction. Perhaps that is the one advantage we possess: experience with impossible survival. Sarek's hologram solidified more completely. The Necrantire refused death itself. We traded our souls for immortality, and in doing so became something less than we were. But we endured. For 60 million years we have endured. That refusal, that stubborn insistence on continuing when all logic says to stop, perhaps, that is the weapon Unicron cannot account for. It has consumed galaxies, yes. But has it ever faced civilizations united in defiance? Then we make our stand, Guilliman declared. Not because we expect to win, not because victory is guaranteed, but because the alternative is to simply wait for consumption. And I would rather die fighting than live on my knees. The celestial spear hummed with building energy, a harmony of 3 civilizations united in defiance. It was not perfect. It was not certain. Every calculation showed more ways it could fail than succeed. But it was all they had, and sometimes all you had was enough. In the depths of the weapon where Necron technology met, Imperial faith met Aeldari craft, something unprecedented occurred. The 3 power sources, each operating on fundamentally different principles, began to resonate together. Not perfectly, there were conflicts, contradictions, moments where the systems fought against each other. But there was also harmony. Unexpected, impossible harmony. As though the universe itself recognized what was being attempted and decided for once to allow it. The weapon was ready. Now they simply had to wait for Unicron to come within range and pray that when the moment came, 3 civilizations united would prove stronger than one hunger eternal. The sun trembled. Across Terra, across Mars, across every inhabited world in the Sol system, instruments designed to measure stellar output registered the anomaly. The star that had burned for 5 billion years, that had given birth to humanity and nurtured it through countless ages, began to dim. Not slowly, not gradually. In the span of 3 heartbeats, the sun's luminosity dropped by 17%. In the Imperial Palace, the Adeptus Astronomica felt it through the Astronomicon itself. The Emperor's beacon, which had burned constant for 10,000 years, flickered. Not like a candle in wind, but like a torch, recognizing the approach of something that consumed light itself. On the golden throne where the Emperor of mankind had sat in agony since the heresy skeletal fingers that had not moved in millennia twitched. Those who attended him, the custodians, the Sisters of Silence, the High Lords themselves, felt his attention shift outward, away from the warp. He had held at bay towards something approaching through the material realm. And across every psychically sensitive mind in the system, a single message burned with the force of divine proclamation. It comes. Roboute Guilliman stood on the command deck of the Macraga's honor flagship of the Ultramarines and watched through void-shielded viewports as reality itself began to warp. The fleet assembled around Terra was the largest concentration of military power the Imperium had mustered since the heresy. Thousands of warships, millions of warriors, the combined might of dozens of Space Marine chapters. It would not be enough. He knew it. Everyone knew it. But they had gathered anyway. Because sometimes you fought even when victory was impossible. because the alternative was to simply wait for extinction. Lord Commander, transmitted Admiral Quarren from the Eternal Vigilance. Augur readings are impossible. Something is approaching from the direction of the Abyssus Veil. Mass signature exceeds maximum sensor range. Gravitational distortion affecting orbits out to the Kuiper Belt. I see it, Gilliman replied, and indeed he did. Through the viewports, through his enhanced transhuman vision, he saw what appeared to be a planet moving through space. Not drifting on orbital mechanics, but moving with purpose, with hunger. Unicron had arrived. The entity that wore planetary scale like a shell, that had consumed galaxies before this one, that had learned to devour gods themselves, entered the Sol system with the inevitability of entropy itself. Its approach warped space-time, creating gravitational lensing effects that made the stars behind it twist into impossible configurations. The sun's output continued to drop, not because Unicron was consuming it yet, but because even the star recognized what approached. Light itself bent toward the devourer, drawn by gravity that should not have been possible by hunger, that transcended physical law. All ships battle stations, Gilliman commanded. This is not a war we can win through force of arms, but we will buy time. We will give the Emperor what he needs to work, and we will show this thing that humanity does not die quietly. The fleet responded. Thousands of ships arranging themselves into defensive formations that had been perfected over 10,000 years of warfare. Lance batteries charged, Nova cannons loaded, torpedo tubes flooded. It was all futile, Gilliman knew. But futility had never stopped the Imperium before. On Mars, in the orbital construction bay where the celestial spear had been built, Yvraine and the Silent King watched the approach alongside their own forces. Eldari craft worlds had positioned themselves throughout the system, their weapons charged with psychic fury. Necron tomb ships phased into reality, their Gauss arrays humming with barely contained power. 3 civilizations united in defiance. It should have been glorious. Instead, it felt desperate. "The weapon is ready," Zarek transmitted. "All systems optimal. Firing solution calculated. We await only the optimal moment." "And if there is no optimal moment?" Yvraine asked quietly. "Then we fire anyway," the Silent King replied, "and hope that desperation proves stronger than certainty." Unicron continued his approach, and as he drew closer, his true scale became apparent. The planet form he wore was larger than Jupiter, its surface a nightmare of mechanical structures and biological components, merged into patterns that hurt to perceive. Eyes opened across that surface, not metaphorical, but literal organs of perception, larger than continents, gazing upon the Sol system with hunger that had existed since before the first stars had learned to burn. The fleet opened fire. Thousands of ships, millions of weapons, gigatons of ordnance launched simultaneously in the largest coordinated barrage the Imperium had ever unleashed. Lance strikes that could crack planets carved furrows across Unicron's surface. Nova cannon rounds that carried the fury of dying stars, impacted with force that should have shattered worlds. Cyclonic torpedoes designed to burn atmospheres exploded in patterns that would have sterilized 100 systems. For 3 seconds, the void between Mars and Jupiter lit up brighter than the sun itself. Bright enough that observers on Terra had to shield their eyes. Then the light faded, and Unicron remained. Unmarked, undamaged, still approaching. "By the Emperor," someone whispered on the command channel. Gilliman felt his secondary heart skip a beat. He had known intellectually that conventional weapons would prove insufficient. But to see it demonstrated so completely, to watch the full might of the Imperium's military power, simply failed to even slow the approach. It was one thing to know, and another to witness. "Continue firing," he ordered, his voice steady despite the horror. "All ships continuous barrage. Make it work for every meter of space it takes." The fleet obeyed. Not because they expected success, but because stopping would mean accepting defeat, and the Imperium had not survived 10,000 years by accepting anything. On the Golden Throne, the Emperor stirred. Captain General Trajan Valoris felt it first through the psychic bond that linked all custodians to their creator and master. The Emperor's consciousness, which had been divided across countless tasks, maintaining the Astronomicon, holding back demons, guiding the Imperium through the depths of the warp, began to contract to focus, to gather itself for one final act. "He rises," Valoris whispered, and across the throne room, every custodian fell to one knee. The Emperor could not leave the Golden Throne. His physical body was too damaged, too dependent on the throne's life support to survive separation. But he was not merely flesh. He was will-incarnated psychic might given purpose across 10 millennia of burning. And from that will, he shaped something unprecedented. The air above the Golden Throne rippled. Reality protested, then yielded, and stepping from nothing, manifesting through sheer force of divine will, came an avatar, a projection of the Emperor, himself unbound by the limitations of his dying flesh. It stood 3 times the height of a custodian, wreathed in golden light that hurt to perceive directly. Its features were indistinct, shifting, showing different faces to different observers. To some it appeared as the Emperor of 30,000 years ago, the warlord of Terra in his prime. To others, it was the face of the Emperor they had never seen, but always imagined, paternal, stern, infinitely capable. The Avatar wore armor that had never existed in the material realm, crafted from solidified faith and 10,000 years of worship. In its hand materialized a weapon, not a sword, though it resembled one, but something more fundamental. The Emperor's will made manifest a blade that could cut not just flesh, but concepts that could wound existence itself. "I am diminished," the Avatar spoke, and its voice carried through every vox channel in the system, through every mind capable of perceiving psychic communication. 10,000 years have burned me from the inside. I am not what I was, but I am enough. I must be enough. The Avatar turned toward the approaching Devourer, and in that moment, every psychically sensitive being in the galaxy felt the Emperor's full attention focus outward. "You have consumed much," the Emperor said, speaking directly to Unicron across the void. "Galaxies, realities, gods. But you have never consumed humanity's refusal to accept extinction. You have never tasted the Emperor's protection. Come then, Devourer. Learn what it means to fight not against power, but against meaning itself." Unicron's response came not in words, but in action. The entity that had been content to approach slowly to savor the terror of its prey suddenly accelerated. Space-time bent around Bets, its gravitational forces intensifying beyond anything physics should have allowed. The outer planets of the Sol system, Neptune, Uranus, were pulled from their orbits, drawn toward the Devourer like moths to flame. Unicron passed between them, and they simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed in explosions of violence, but consumed so completely that not even debris remained. One moment, planets that had existed for billions of years. The next, nothing but spreading void. "Emperor's mercy." Admiral Quarren transmitted, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "It consumed 2 planets in seconds. At this rate, it will reach Terra within the hour." Then we have 1 hour to prove that this galaxy will not be consumed quietly, Gilliman responded. All ships full assault. Draw its attention. Make it look at us instead of Terra. Buy the Emperor time. The fleet charged. Not a coordinated advance, but a suicide rush, thousands of ships accelerating towards something that could consume planets. It was madness. It was desperation. It was exactly what the Imperium had been built to do, throw bodies at impossible threats, until either the threat fell or the bodies ran out. Lance strikes carved patterns across Unicron's surface. Torpedoes impacted with force that should have cracked continents. Boarding pods impossibly were launched, carrying space marines who knew they would not return but went anyway, seeking any weakness, any flaw they could exploit. The Devourer's response was almost casual. Portions of its surface reconfigured mechanical structures, shifting to form weapons that had no equivalent in Imperial arsenals. Energy beams that didn't just destroy, but unmade deleting ships from existence rather than exploding them. Gravitational fields that crushed warships into singularities, compressing them to points of infinite density before consuming even that. The fleet died. Hundreds of ships in the first minute, thousands in the first 5. But they bought time, and in that time the Emperor acted. The golden avatar flew through the void not propelled by engines, but by will alone. It moved faster than light should have allowed, crossing the distance between Terra and Unicron in seconds. And as it flew, it gathered power, pulling psychic energy from every human in the Sol system, from every prayer offered to the Golden Throne, from the accumulated faith of 10,000 years. Behind the avatar, reality itself seemed to tear, leaving a wake of golden fire that burned without consuming light that existed in dimensions beyond the physical. The Emperor's avatar struck Unicron with force that registered on seismic instruments across every world in the system. The impact point where divine will met primordial hunger exploded with energies that existed in spectrums invisible to mortal eyes. Psychic shockwaves rippled outward, causing every psyker within 10 light-years to collapse in agony. For the first time since entering the system, Unicron recoiled. Not far, not significantly, but the pressure eased, the gravitational distortion lessened, and for a moment, just a moment, the Devourer's attention focused entirely on the glowing figure that dared to strike it. Now, Gilliman transmitted to the Celestial Spear's control center. While it's distracted, fire everything. On Mars, in the orbital platform, where 3 civilizations had united to build the impossible, the Celestial Spear activated. Necron living metal phased through dimensions, existing simultaneously in multiple states of reality. Aeldari Wraithbone channeled the psychic energy of billions of souls, Aeldari, who had died fighting for survival humans, who had sacrificed themselves to the Emperor, even the fragment of Tsinch that had been woven into the weapon's core. Imperial faith formed the guidance system. Prayers and devotion converted into targeting data, more precise than any machine could calculate. The weapon fired. What emerged was not a beam or a projectile, but something more fundamental. A lance of compressed meaning of existence, refined to its purest form. It carried within it the combined will of 3 civilizations, declaring that reality would not be consumed, that consciousness had value beyond mere energy, that life meant something more than fuel for cosmic predators. The Celestial Spear crossed the void in an instant too fast for light itself, moving through folded space on principles that violated causality. It struck Unicron in the center of mass, where the entity's true core resided beneath layers of planetary shell. And for the first time in eons beyond counting, Unicron screamed. Not in pain, the Devourer was beyond such mortal concepts. but in surprise and recognition that something had actually wounded it, had actually pierced through defenses that had withstood the assault of entire civilizations. The wound was not large, not compared to Unicron's planetary scale, but it was real bleeding energies that reality itself rejected, spilling darkness that consumed light wherever it touched. "We heard it," Yvraine whispered, hardly daring to believe. "The weapon worked. We actually heard it." "Then we fire again," Sarek commanded. "All power to the spear. Prepare for second volley." But Unicron was learning. The Devourer had consumed countless civilizations, had absorbed the knowledge and tactics of species beyond counting. It recognized threat now understood that these mortals possessed something dangerous, something that required attention. The eyes across its surface focused on Mars, on the celestial spear, and on the three leaders who had dared to wound it. And when Unicron opened its mouth, when the jaws that had consumed planets began to gape, the intention was clear. It would devour Mars. The weapon would be destroyed along with everyone who had created it. "All ships intercept course," Guilliman commanded, though he knew it was futile. "Protect Mars at any cost." The remaining fleet, a fraction of what had begun the battle, threw itself between Unicron and the Red Planet. Ships that had no hope of survival positioned themselves as shields, their crews accepting death to buy seconds of time. It would not be enough. Then the Emperor's avatar moved again. It had been fighting Unicron, directly divine will against primordial hunger, and the battle had been magnificent and terrible. Every strike of the Emperor's blade carved wounds that bled impossible energies. Every counterattack from Unicron required the Avatar to rebuild itself from pure will, reforming damaged structures through faith alone. Now the Emperor changed tactics. Instead of attacking Unicron's outer shell, he drove deep, plunging through layers of mechanical and biological structure, forcing his way toward the core. The journey was agony. Even in Avatar form, even protected by divine power, the Emperor felt himself being eroded, consumed by the hunger that permeated every atom of Unicron's being. But he pressed on, because humanity needed him, because 10,000 years of burning had been preparation for this moment, because a father does not abandon his children, even when all hope seems lost. In the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, in a sanctum that only the highest custodians knew existed, a weapon was retrieved. It had been sealed there since before the heresy so ancient that even its name had been forgotten by most. But the Emperor remembered. He had recovered it during the dark age of technology, had recognized its significance, had kept it safe against the day when humanity would face a threat beyond conventional warfare. The matrix of leadership. It was not of human make, not of Aeldari or Necrontire origin either. It was older, forged by a civilization that had preceded all of them, by beings who had learned to channel not just energy, but meaning itself. The matrix was a key, a focusing lens, a bridge between physical and metaphysical. And it was exactly what the Emperor needed. The custodians brought it forth, a crystalline construct that pulsed with light that had never dimmed in eons. They bore it to the throne room, to the withered husk that was the Emperor's physical form, and placed it before him. Through the Avatar, the Emperor reached back across the gulf of space and claimed the matrix. The artifact's power flowed through the connection, merging with his own divine might, amplifying and focusing it in ways that even he had not fully understood until this moment. "Guilliman," the Emperor transmitted, his voice reaching the Primarch directly. "The celestial spear. Reconfigure its targeting to my coordinates. When I give the signal, fire everything. Do not hesitate. Do not question." Just fire. Father? Gilliman replied, and in that single word was a lifetime of questions, doubts, and faith. What are you doing? What I should have done at Molech, the Emperor replied. What I have always been meant to do. I am protecting humanity. Now prepare to fire. The Emperor's avatar, carrying the power of the Matrix, drove deeper into Unicron's core. It passed through defenses that had turned aside attacks from Cetan, through armor forged from the collapse of realities. Every meter was agony. Every second burned away portions of the Emperor's strength. The interior of Unicron was a nightmare made real. Corridors that existed in impossible geometries, structures that defied physics, spaces where matter and energy merged into forms that should not have been stable. The Emperor pushed through them all, his blade carving a path through obstacles that had withstood eons. Demons that had been consumed by Unicron, their essence absorbed but not destroyed, reached out from the walls like ghosts. The Emperor ignored them. They were nothing compared to what he sought, the core itself, the heart of hunger. The pressure increased with every meter. Not just physical pressure, though, that was immense, but metaphysical weight, the accumulated mass of consumed realities, pressing down, trying to add the Emperor to the catalog of everything Unicron had eaten. The Avatar's form began to crack golden light, leaking through fractures in its structure. The Emperor drew on reserves he did not have, burning the very essence of his being to maintain cohesion just a little longer. Just far enough. Just deep enough. The custodians on Terra felt it through their bond. Their master was dying, truly dying this time, not merely wounded, but consumed by the very act of salvation. Many wept, though their training had supposedly purged such weakness. Some screamed, though custodians did not scream. All felt the universe becoming a darker place. With each meter the Emperor descended. But he reached it. The heart of Unicron, the core where the hunger itself resided, the central consciousness that had consumed galaxies. It was not what the Emperor had expected. Not a brain or a soul or a governing system. It was simpler and more terrible. It was the absence of existence given awareness. A void that had learned to think, to plan, to hunger with purpose rather than mere instinct. Where the Emperor was light incarnate, Unicron's core was darkness made conscious. Not evil, implied intent beyond mere nature. This was simply what it was. The end. The void, the silence that waited after all things ceased. You are alone. Unicron's voice emerged from that void, speaking directly to the Emperor's consciousness. You stand against inevitability. I am the end of all things. You cannot prevent what must be. As, perhaps, the Emperor replied, raising the blade that was his will made manifest. But I can delay it. And in that delay, life has time to grow, to evolve, to perhaps find a way to transcend even you. You offer ending. I offer possibility. He struck. Not with the blade, though, that weapon carved deep, but with the Matrix, with all the power it contained, with 10,000 years of humanity's faith and suffering and desperate hope channeled through a single point. The Emperor drove the Matrix into the heart of the void, into the core of hunger itself, and let it burn. Gilliman, now, the Emperor transmitted. Fire the spear, fire everything. On Mars, without hesitation, without question, the Lord Commander of the Imperium gave the order. The celestial spear fired again. But this time, it was not aimed at Unicron's shell. It was aimed at the Emperor's coordinates, at the heart of the Devourer, where the Emperor had driven the Matrix deep, the weapon's power. Necron technology, Aeldari psychic craft. Imperial faith and Sench's shard, all unified, struck the matrix at the precise moment of maximum resonance. What followed was not an explosion. It was something more fundamental. A rejection of existence by non-existence. A meeting point where reality and void annihilated each other in a cascade of ontological paradox. Unicron screamed again, but this time the scream carried pain. Genuine damage, the wound not just to its form, but to its very being. The matrix burned within it like a cancer spreading, consuming, teaching the devourer what it meant to be devoured. "Father," Guilliman transmitted, "get out of there. Withdraw before—" "No," the Emperor replied, and his voice carried the weight of finality. "This is what I was made for. To burn, to sacrifice, to give everything so that humanity might survive. Tell them I was proud, that they exceeded every hope I held, that they must continue, must thrive, must never surrender. Father, please." But the connection was already fading. The Emperor's avatar, having spent all its power in driving the Matrix home, began to dissolve. Not destroyed, but consumed by the very weapon it had activated, its essence burning as fuel for the rejection that was tearing Unicron apart from within. In the throne room, the Emperor's physical form convulsed once, then stilled. Not dead. He was far beyond such simple endings, but spent, utterly exhausted, every reserve of power, burned away in that final act. The Astronomicon flickered once, twice, and went dark. For the first time in 10,000 years, humanity's beacon went out. In the void above Terra, Unicron thrashed. The wound in its core was spreading the matrix, burning through its structure, like holy fire through corruption. But it was not dead. Not yet. It had survived the death of galaxies. It would survive this too, given time to adapt, to heal, to consume the weapon that had wounded it. But time was the one thing it would not be given. All ships. Guilliman commanded, his voice hollow with grief, but still carrying absolute authority. Ram it. Every ship, every weapon, every life. We end this now while it's wounded. We give the Emperor's sacrifice meaning. The remaining fleet obeyed. Crippled warships, their crews already dead or dying, turned toward Unicron on final approach vectors. Ships that had fled earlier, their captains ashamed, returned to die with honor. Even civilian vessels' evacuation transports that should have been fleeing to the outer system turned back to contribute what little they could. Thousands of ships became thousands of missiles, hurling themselves at the wounded devourer. The Necron fleet joined them, tomb ships phasing into Unicron's structure to detonate their power cores from within. The Aeldari craft worlds opened their infinity circuits, releasing the stored souls of billions to burn like stars against the devourer's flesh. 3 civilizations united in final desperation, threw everything they had at the wounded god. And slowly, impossibly, it began to work. Unicron's form destabilized. The wound in its core, fed by the Matrix and sustained by the sacrifice of billions, spread faster than the Devourer could adapt. Sections of its planetary shell broke away, consumed from within by the very hunger that defined it. "We're pushing it back." Admiral Quarren reported, his voice carrying disbelief. "Gravitational readings show it's being pulled away from Terra, toward the sun." "Not away," Sarek corrected, his mechanical voice carrying grim satisfaction. "Toward. We're not pushing it. We're herding it. Toward the one place in this system with enough gravitational force to hold something of its mass." Guilliman understood immediately. "The sun. We're pushing it into the sun." More precisely, the Silent King replied, into a solar orbit from which it cannot escape. Unicron is wounded, but not dead. We cannot destroy it, but we can trap it. Seal it inside the star itself, where the pressure and heat will prevent it from reforming, where it will remain until the sun itself dies. How long? Yvraine asked. Billions of years, Sarek responded. If we succeed, if the sun holds, if Unicron does not adapt faster than we can contain it. There are many ifs, but it is all we have. The wounded devourer, driven by the combined assault of 3 civilizations, unable to focus enough to resist, while the matrix burned in its core was pushed back. Meter by meter, kilometer by kilometer, drawn by the sun's gravity and the relentless attacks of ships that refused to stop dying. It took 3 more hours. In those hours, 90% of the fleet was destroyed. Entire Space Marine chapters ceased to exist. The Lamenters who had suffered for millennia died to the last man. The Celestial Lions, already diminished, sacrificed themselves completely. The Mentors, the Raptors, the Scythes of the Emperor. Chapter after chapter added their names to the roll of those who would not be forgotten. Craft worlds that had survived since the fall were consumed. Ayandin, already wounded by Tyranids, gave its last. Luganath, my Miara Kylor, ancient vessels carrying the souls of billions, reduced to debris in Unicron's wake. But each craft world, as it died, released its infinity circuit, allowing the souls within to burn one final time against the darkness. Tomb worlds that had endured for 60 million years went silent. The Mynarch dynasty, the Charnovok, the Atun-Necron dynasties, whose names predated the rise of humanity, whose warriors had fought in the war in heaven itself, spent their final operational cycles driving Unicron toward the sun. And still, they came. Supply ships ramming at full thrust. Damaged destroyers with their crews already dead. Guided by servitors, programmed for one final task. Even civilian vessels evacuation transports, whose captains chose to die with purpose rather than flee to meaningless safety. This is Merchant Captain Hollis Vale of the freighter Endless Bounty. Came one transmission broadcast on all frequencies. We carry no weapons. We are not soldiers, but we are human, and we will not watch our species die quietly. For the Emperor, for Terra, for the future. The freighter, designed to carry grain between agri-worlds, became a missile traveling at relativistic speeds. It struck Unicron's wounded core and detonated its plasma drives in a final act of defiance. It changed nothing. And yet it changed everything. Because across the fleet, across the 3 civilizations, beings who had moments before been considering retreat or surrender found their resolve renewed. If civilians could face extinction with such courage, how could warriors do less? But Unicron fell into the sun. Not consumed. The Devourer was too vast, too fundamental to be destroyed by mere stellar fire. But trapped, pulled into an orbit that spiraled toward the solar core, held there by gravitational forces too strong even for it to overcome while wounded. The matrix continued to burn within it, spreading, preventing recovery, keeping the wound open. And as Unicron sank deeper into the sun, the star's outer layers began to close over it, sealing the Devourer away in a prison of nuclear fire. It's done, Gilliman whispered, hardly daring to believe. We did it. We actually did it. For now, Sarek cautioned. The sun will hold it for eons, but Unicron is patient. It will adapt. Eventually it will escape, or the sun will die and it will be freed. This is not victory. It is delay. Delay is enough, Yvraine replied. Delay gives life time to continue, to grow, to perhaps find a permanent solution. We have bought the galaxy a future that is worth every sacrifice. On Terra, in the throne room, the custodians stood vigil over their emperor's form. He still lived, but barely, his power so depleted that even maintaining the basic functions of his body required all the throne's support. But he had saved humanity. One final time he had given everything to protect his species. The Astronomicon remained dark. The Imperium would have to learn to navigate without it, to function without the beacon that had guided them for 10,000 years. It would be difficult. Many would die in the confusion. But they would survive, because the Emperor had bought them time. In the orbital platform above Mars, Guilliman, Ivrain, and Sarek's hologram watched the sun now containing a prisoner that would rage in stellar fire for billions of years. Around them, the survivors gathered. Space Marines from a dozen chapters, their armor scarred and their numbers decimated. Eldari warriors who had seen craft worlds die. Necron constructs running on backup power, their tomb worlds depleted. They were few. So terribly few compared to what had begun the battle. But they were alive, and in their survival, billions more would have the chance to continue. What happens now? Ivrain asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion of one who had witnessed the end of ages. Now. Guilliman replied, his gaze never leaving the sun. We rebuild. We remember. We prepare. The Emperor gave us time, perhaps millions of years, perhaps billions. We use that time to grow stronger, to understand what we faced, to ensure that if Unicron ever escapes the galaxy, we'll be ready. He turned to face the others, and in his eyes was the weight of leadership that came from being one of the Emperor's sons. But more than that, we remember what we accomplished here. 3 civilizations that have hated each other for 10,000 years stood together. We set aside pride doctrine, ancient grievances. We proved that survival is possible when we unite. Do not romanticize it overmuch, Sarek cautioned, though his mechanical voice carried something that might have been approval. This alliance was born of desperation. When the immediate threat passes, old hatreds may resurface. The Necrons still seek to reclaim the galaxy. The Eldari still remember the war in heaven. The Imperium still considers all Xenos as enemies. Perhaps, Guilliman acknowledged, but we have proven it is possible. That is worth remembering. And perhaps when the next crisis comes, and there will be another crisis, we will remember this day. We will remember that we are stronger united than divided. Hope, Sarek repeated, and his mechanical voice carried something that might have been genuine emotion. A concept I had forgotten. The Necron Tire traded our souls for immortality and called it victory. But what is immortality without purpose? What is existence without meaning? Perhaps you mortals who burn so briefly have taught this ancient king something after all. That it is better to die with meaning than to exist forever in emptiness. Ivrain placed a hand on the observation window, her reflection ghostly against the distant sun. Inead teaches us that death is not the end, but transformation. Today, billions died. But their deaths were not meaningless. They transformed defeat into survival. They turned extinction into hope. That is the victory we carry forward. The 3 leaders stood in silence, watching the sun. Within its depths, Unicron raged, trapped, but not dead hungry, but unable to feed. The matrix burned within it like a thorn, preventing healing, ensuring the prison held, and would hold for eons uncounted until stars themselves grew old and died. What happens now? Ivrain asked. Now, Guilliman replied. We rebuild, we remember, we prepare. Because even if Unicron is trapped for eons, there will be other threats. The galaxy is not safe, but it is alive. And as long as it lives, there is hope. Hope, Sarek repeated, and his mechanical voice carried something that might have been genuine emotion. A concept I had forgotten. Perhaps you mortals have taught this ancient king something after all. The three leaders stood in silence, watching the sun. Within its depths, Unicron raged, trapped but not dead hungry, but unable to feed. The matrix burned within it like a thorn, preventing healing, ensuring the prison held. It was not a happy ending. The Emperor was spent. The fleet was destroyed. Entire worlds had been consumed. The galaxy had been scarred in ways it would take millennia to heal. But it was an ending. And in a galaxy that had known only war for 10,000 years, that was enough. The age of silence had been delayed. The age of survival had begun. 500 years after the entombment. The sun was dying. Not quickly, stars did not die quickly, not when measured against mortal lifespans. But the change was observable, measurable, undeniable to those who had instruments sensitive enough and memory long enough to perceive it. Agatha 9 had both. She stood in the Observatory of Last Light, a structure built on the ruins of what had once been the Cathedral Mechanicus of Mars. The cathedral was gone consumed in the battle that had saved the galaxy. But the observatory had been built from its bones, using salvaged technology and the desperation that came from knowing humanity lived on borrowed time. Through the observatory's enhanced optics, Agatha 9 watched the sun. To organic eyes, it would have appeared unchanged. Still burning, still providing light and heat to the surviving worlds of the Sol system. But her enhanced vision, augmented by 5 centuries of modifications and improvements, saw what others could not. The sun was shrinking. Millimeter by millimeter, year by year, its mass was being consumed from within. Unicron was not dead. Unicron could not die. It was hunger given form, and hunger was eternal. Trapped in the solar core, wounded by the matrix of leadership and the Emperor's sacrifice. The Devourer had done what it always did. When wounded, it fed. It consumed the nuclear fires that sustained the star, converting stellar matter into energy, energy into nothing. The process was slow by cosmic standards, constrained by the prison that held it by the wound that would not heal. But it was inexorable. 537 years, Agatha 9 said aloud, though there was no one to hear. Her voice emerged through Vox synthesizers, mechanical approximations of human speech. She had not been born, Agatha 9. That number was a designation marking how many times she had rebuilt herself, how many iterations of consciousness transfers she had undergone to extend her existence beyond natural limits. She could not remember her original name anymore. Could not remember if she had ever been fully human, or if that humanity had been shed piece by piece like a snake's skin, until nothing remained but the pattern that called itself Agatha. 537 years since the entombment. She continued speaking to the silent observatory, to the data logs that recorded everything to a future that might never come. The sun has lost 0.0037% of its mass. At current rate of consumption, stellar collapse will begin in approximately 4,000 years. The Sol system has 4 millennia before the sun dies, and Unicron is freed. 4,000 years. It sounded like a long time. It was not. She turned from the viewport and moved through the observatory, her mechanical body requiring no rest, no sustenance beyond the solar power that her skin plating absorbed. Around her, The ruins of Mars stretched to the horizon, a world that had once been humanity's forge, now reduced to monuments of what had been lost. The Imperium still existed, but it was diminished almost beyond recognition. Without the Astronomicon, warp travel had become impossibly dangerous. The network of worlds that had once spanned the galaxy had fragmented into isolated pockets, each one struggling to survive without support from Terra, without the guidance of the Emperor's light. Psychers had become increasingly rare. The warp itself had not recovered from Unicron's feeding. It remained weak-thin, barely capable of sustaining the phenomena that had once defined it. Fewer children were born with psychic gifts. Those who were often found their powers fading by adulthood, as though the universe itself was forgetting how to produce such beings. The Chaos Gods were gone. Not dead gods could not die in any meaningful sense, but absent, silent. The warp no longer carried their whispers, their temptations, their promises of power. The cults that had worshipped them for millennia simply faded, their prayers unanswered, their sacrifices meaningless. Agatha 9 had studied the theological implications extensively. In the archives she maintained in the data cores that preserved humanity's knowledge, she had documented a paradox. The Imperium had been built to fight chaos, had defined itself through opposition to the dark gods. Now, with those gods gone, with the warp itself dying, the Imperium was forced to confront a question it had never needed to answer. What was humanity without an enemy to define itself against? She descended through the observatory's levels, passing through chambers where other survivors worked. They were few. Mars had been devastated in the battle, its population reduced from billions to mere millions. But those who remained had purpose. They maintained the records. They preserved the knowledge. And they watched the sun monitoring the prison that held humanity's doom at bay. In the Hall of Remembrance, Agatha 9 paused before a memorial that took up an entire wall. Names carved in living metal updated continuously as new information was recovered from the ruins. Every ship that had died in the battle, every chapter of Space Marines that had been lost, every craft world consumed, every tomb world silenced. Billions of names. Trillions if you counted every individual's soul rather than just the vessels they had served on. And at the top, in letters that gleamed with eternal light, the Emperor of Mankind, who burned so. That humanity might endure, Agatha 9 had never been particularly religious. Even before her transformations, she had viewed the imperial cult with skepticism, seeing it as a tool for social control rather than genuine faith. But standing before the memorial, she felt something that might have been reverence. The Emperor had saved them. Not perfectly, the galaxy was broken, the Imperium fragmented, the future uncertain. But he had bought them time. And time was the most precious resource any civilization could possess. "What did you see, I wonder?" she asked the memorial quietly. "When you looked into Unicron's core, when you drove the Matrix into that void, what did you understand that we do not? Did you know the cost would be so high? Did you know the Astronomicon would die with you?" The memorial offered no answers. It never did. She moved on, descending to the archives of the fallen, where the history of the battle had been preserved in exhaustive detail. Every sensor reading, every Vox transmission, every final word spoken by those who had died, saving the galaxy. Scholars from across the Sol system, what remained of it, came here to study, to understand, to learn from what had been accomplished. But they were few. So terribly few. The Aldari have withdrawn, Agatha 9 said to the empty archives, continuing her habit of narration, of speaking aloud the truths that others were afraid to acknowledge. The surviving craft worlds fled to the edges of the galaxy, seeking isolation, seeking to preserve what remains of their species. They do not answer our calls. They do not participate in the alliance anymore. Can we blame them? They gave everything. They lost Iyanden Luganath, so many others. And for what? To buy a few thousand years before the prison fails. She accessed a data screen, pulling up reports from the few ships that still maintained contact with the wider galaxy. The news was always the same: humanity, contracting worlds, going dark civilizations that had endured for millennia, simply ceasing to communicate. The Necrons fare better, she continued. Their technology does not depend on the warp. The Silent King has maintained some level of coordination between tomb worlds. They continue to monitor the sun, to study the prison, to search for ways to reinforce it. But even they acknowledge the truth: Unicron cannot be held forever. The wound will heal, given enough time. Or the sun will die and the prison will fail. Either way, the end remains inevitable. She closed the data screen and moved to the deepest level of the archives, where the most dangerous knowledge was kept. Here, in sealed vaults that required her highest-level clearance to access, were the records of what humanity had learned from the battle, the structure of Dark Energon, the nature of entities that existed before and beyond conventional reality, the theological implications of fighting something that consumed gods as easily as mortals. And one piece of information that Agatha 9 had not shared with anyone, that she kept locked away in her own memory cores, encrypted so thoroughly that only death would release it. Unicron was not unique. In the data recovered from Tzeentch's shard, in the final transmissions of ships that had ventured too close to Unicron's core, there were references, fragmentary, incomplete, but unmistakable. References to others. To siblings, perhaps, or equivalents. To entities that existed in other galaxies, other realities serving the same function, ending things, consuming possibility, reducing everything to silence. The galaxy had faced one devourer, and survived only by sacrificing everything. What would they do when the others came? What would any civilization do when the universe itself seemed designed to eventually erase all evidence of consciousness, of life, of meaning? "We won," Agatha 9 whispered to the sealed vaults. "We actually won. We wounded something that had consumed galaxies. We proved that even cosmic predators can be fought, can be trapped, can be denied their prey. But we paid such a price. And the victory is temporary. 4,000 years if we are fortunate. Perhaps less if Unicron adapts faster than we predict." She had run the calculations countless times. 4,000 years was not enough to rebuild the Imperium to its former strength. Not enough to develop new weapons, new defenses, new strategies. Barely enough to preserve the knowledge they had gained, to pass it forward to whatever civilizations might come after. "Perhaps that is the point," she said, a new thought crystallizing in her mechanical consciousness. "Perhaps we were never meant to survive indefinitely. Perhaps consciousness itself is temporary, a brief spark in the darkness before the void claims everything. The universe is vast and old and cold, and we are small and new and warm. Our very existence is an act of defiance against entropy. And Unicron is simply entropy given purpose, the universe's immune system responding to the infection of life." It was a bleak philosophy, but Agatha 9 had lived through the death of hope enough times to recognize truth when she encountered it. She returned to the observatory's primary viewing chamber and resumed her vigil. The sun burned before her, looking eternal and unchanging to casual observation. But she could see the truth, could measure with instruments more precise than any organic sense the slow diminishment the prison was holding. The matrix continued to burn within Unicron's core, preventing healing, maintaining the wound. The Emperor's sacrifice had not been in vain. But it was a temporary victory. And temporary was all any victory had ever been. A proximity alarm chimed, the first in 17 years. Agatha 9's sensors registered a ship entering Mars orbit, broadcasting old Imperial identification codes that had not been updated in centuries. She accessed the communication channels, her consciousness expanding through the observatory systems with the ease of long practice. Unidentified vessel, this is Mars Orbital Control Observatory of Last Light. Identify yourself and state your purpose. The response came through channels thick with static, degraded by centuries of technological decline. This is Skolam Vessel Pride of Macragge, carrying historical delegation, requesting permission to access archives. Agatha 9 felt something that might have been satisfaction. Another group of scholars seeking to understand what had happened to learn from the past. They came occasionally, these historians and theologians and strategists, hoping to find answers in the records of the battle. She always granted them access. Because if knowledge was not preserved, if the lessons learned were not passed forward, then the sacrifice had truly been meaningless. Permission granted, she transmitted. Docking Bay 7, welcome to Mars. Welcome to the Observatory of Last Light. As the ship began its descent, Agatha 9 turned back to the viewport to her eternal vigil. 537 years she had stood here. 537 years of watching, measuring, recording the slow consumption of the sun. How many more years remained to her? Her body was more machine than human now, capable of self-repair, of replacement, of persistence beyond natural limits. She could potentially observe for millennia, watching as the sun dimmed year by year, as Unicron slowly digested the light itself. The thought should have been horrifying. Instead, she found it almost comforting. Someone had to bear witness. Someone had to maintain the records to ensure that when the end came, when Unicron finally broke free and the galaxy faced its final test, there would be knowledge to guide the defenders. If there were any defenders left. "He's not dead," she said quietly, speaking to the sun, to Unicron trapped within, to the universe itself. "You're not dead. You're just waiting, digesting, adapting, learning from what wounded you. When you emerge, you'll be stronger. You'll have consumed our strategies, our weapons, our very understanding of how to resist you." The sun burned on, indifferent to her words. "We won the battle." Agatha 9 continued, her voice carrying no particular emotion. She had long since lost the capacity for such things, or perhaps had deliberately excised it as inefficient. "But we didn't win the war. We bought time. Perhaps that's all any victory has ever been, buying time, delaying the inevitable, giving life a few more moments to exist before the darkness claims everything." Behind her, she heard the delegation entering the observatory. Voices carrying wonder and grief in equal measure as they saw the Hall of Remembrance, as they read the names of the fallen, as they understood the true scale of what had been sacrificed. She would meet with them shortly. Would answer their questions, grant them access to the archives, help them understand what had happened 5 centuries ago. It was her purpose now, the reason she continued to function when so many others had given up, had let themselves fade into the entropy that claimed all things eventually. But for now, she stood at the viewport and watched the sun, watched the prison that held humanity's doom, watched as millimeter by millimeter, year by year, the star slowly died. "We thought we were the victors," Agatha 9 whispered. "We thought we had saved the galaxy. But looking at you now, measuring your slow consumption of our star, I wonder if we merely delayed our own digestion. If Unicron is patient enough to let us live out our natural span, to let civilizations rise and fall a few more times before it finishes its meal, The sun offered no answer. It never did. In the void beyond Mars, beyond Terra, beyond the surviving worlds of the Sol system, the galaxy continued to turn. Species evolved, civilizations rose, wars were fought over territory and resources and ideologies that would mean nothing when the sun finally died. 4,000 years remained, perhaps less, perhaps more if they were fortunate. In the grand scope of cosmic time, it was barely a heartbeat, a brief reprieve before the inevitable conclusion. But it was all they had, and sometimes all you had was enough. Agatha 9 turned from the viewport and went to greet the historians, to share the knowledge, to preserve the memory, to ensure that when the end came, when Unicron broke free and the final battle began, those who fought would at least understand what they faced. It was not hope. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. But it was purpose. And in the age of ashes, purpose was all that remained. The sun burned on its light, dimming imperceptibly, its heart slowly consumed by hunger eternal. The prison held. The galaxy endured, and in the observatory of last light, Agatha 9 kept her vigil, watching, waiting, recording the slow approach of an ending that had merely been delayed, never prevented. The age of chaos had ended 5 centuries ago. The age of silence awaited in the future. This was the age of ashes, the time between where the fires still burned, but the fuel was running out, where victory tasted of ash and defeat waited patiently in the heart of the sun. And in that age, humanity did what it had always done. It endured. It survived. It refused to surrender, even knowing surrender was inevitable, because that was what it meant to be human. To stare into the void and say, "Not yet, not yet."